Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I still hear that sound in my head like it happened 5 minutes ago. I went out that day like I always do, bow in the truck, boots on, a thermos of coffee gone cold in the cup holder. Long's Lake sits out in Gunnison County, where the aspens take over whole hillsides and you can get lost without trying. My buddy and I had planned a quick stalk, nothing fancy. Mid-morning light was coming through the trees, and the air was thin and cold in a way that makes you breathe shallow and listen harder. We were moving through a stand of aspens, thin trunks, a lot of brass-colored leaves trembling in a breeze you could see more than hear. It's an area I know. I know the deer patterns around there. I know how a bear sounds when it moves through the understory. I know how elk bugle and how coyotes yip. That's why what happened broke something in me. It was a sound and a behavior that fit none of the animals I know. We were being careful, whispering the way hunters do. The ground was littered with leaves and little rocks that crack underfoot. Every time we took a step, the woods answered with a whole chorus of tiny noises, branches, leaves, the creak of an old tree. Then, after 20-30 minutes of moving slowly and staying low, my buddy stopped. I did the same. We hold like that a lot, still as a tree, waiting for a movement that tells you where the deer is. The woods folded around us, and then we heard it behind us. Not a scent, not a glimpse at first, just a sound like steps. Heavy, but not like a man in boots. Each impact had a slow thud to it, not staccato like a rabbit or crisp like a rock. The thing was following us in perfect time. I mean perfect. We would stop breathing, stop moving, and the steps would stop. We would start again, putting one foot in front of the other, and the steps would return, matching our pace almost exactly, like some person trying to copy our every move without being seen. Nobody says anything in that pause because there is nothing to say that helps. My heart started to notch up under my ribs. Hunters get strange sounds in their heads. Your imagination runs because the body wants you to be alert, but this wasn't imagination. I closed my eyes for a second to focus on where the sound set down in the dirt, and it felt almost like pressure in the air behind me, as if the forest itself was leaning. We kept walking because we heard deer somewhere ahead. The wind was favorable, so I eased us forward, drawn by a silhouette. The deer was about 15 meters out, standing in a little opening, broadside, unaware. My training kicked in. I knocked an arrow, pulled to anchor, and settled on the shoulder. I remember the give of the bow, the release, the whistle of the arrow. The deer dropped in one motion, a soft thump into the leaves. The instant it hit the ground, whatever had been following us answered. It let out a sound I can still not make sense of, sharp, deep, and it kept going for a long second, held like someone holding a note and not letting it go. It cut clean through the aspens. It was daytime, bright, and the sound was as clear as the sun. It hit the hollow behind my eyes and made the hair on my neck stand up. I knew right away it wasn't a bear. Bears make huffs and snorts, and they can be loud and violent, but this was not that. I've watched bears at night with a flashlight. This was something with a different instrument. There's no way to describe the way that sound lands on you. It wasn't one little noise and then nothing. It was deep and long, and it seemed to sit in the air, like a held breath that had weight. It didn't echo like a shout. It seemed to carry its own pressure and push. I tried to look back in the same instant, because by then the stupid human part of you wants to see and name what's making that sound. My buddy grabbed my sleeve and pulled hard. No words, just the tug. That pull was enough. We both spun and started moving before the last of that call even finished. I wish I could say we bolted and it was just noise behind us, but the thing was furious. It broke branches on its way through the undergrowth. I heard trunks crack off to my left and right, twigs snapping like someone running through an old barn of dry lumber. The noise was not distant. It kept pace with us. I don't mean it gained on us. I mean it matched our run. We were full sprinting downhill toward the jeep, boots sliding on loose dirt, hearts hammering, lungs burning. Each time our feet hit the ground, we heard a matching impact somewhere back in the trees. It was close enough that every snap of a twig sounded painted in front of us, and there was a wet, hollow sound in the echoes, like a heavy thing moving with intent. Running for a pickup in the woods with a bow and a quiver slapping your back is different than running on a road. You're sideways, you're dodging roots, you're throwing your weight into a jump over a log. I remember the sting along the side of my calf where I clipped a branch and the taste of metal from biting down on a gasp. I did not look back. My buddy didn't either. It's one of those little rules you make up in your head when you're young and stupid enough to have learned them in the woods. Don't look back. Looking back makes you slower. Looking back is how they get you. We hit the dirt around the jeep, and both of us fumbled for the keys. In the second it took to find metal in a pocket, I thought I felt the ground vibrate with a heavy step just to the right of the hood. Maybe it was only the sound, but I could feel that weight in my chest. My hands were shaking so bad I had to slap the key against the ignition with 2 tries before it turned. The second the engine caught, we peeled out. There was no radio on, no music, just the sound of our tires on packed dirt and the trees whipping by. We didn't slow down until the line of trees gave way to open road. We only turned off after we'd put distance between us and the aspens where the deer fell. When we stopped for the first time, we were both hunched over, breathing like someone had just run a mile. We looked at each other and both had the same blank look. It's the kind of silence that isn't empty. It's full of things you don't want to name. We didn't go back for the deer. That part eats at me still, leaving it there. But in that moment, the choice to keep going was so automatic, it didn't leave room for ethics. We drove into town, and I pulled up at the Conoco on Main Street because it was where people hung out if they were local, and because I needed to throw up or shout or do something that wasn't sitting in silence. I went inside and saw Jack behind the counter. I used to stop there sometimes after a morning run into the hills. He knows the faces that come through town. I walked up and told him, plain as I could, that something had been following us in the aspens and had answered when the deer hit the ground. I kept it simple because my mouth kept going dry. It screamed, I said. I don't remember the exact cadence, but I remember watching him listen. Jack looked at me. He's the kind of guy who's seen a lot around Gunnison County. He was quiet for a second, and then he said, "I believe you." Not maybe, not that's a story, just I believe you. It's a small thing, but when somebody who knows the woods says that to you, it lands hard. It stopped me in the place where shock meets reason, and I felt both relieved and more keyed up at the same time. Because if someone who pumps gas on Main Street and knows the hills tells you he believes you, that validates the fear in a way that doesn't help you sleep. After that, there's a stretch where everything is a blur. We left without talking much, paying for a coffee and then staring at the window. On the drive back toward home, I kept seeing the aspens and the place where the deer had gone down. I kept hearing that held deep note over and over in my head, clear as the sun, everything else quiet in comparison. My hands trembled on the wheel like I'd grabbed a live wire. It's a weird thing when something is so loud and so immediate that it burns into your memory that way. The sound is there before the rest of the memory, like a thumbnail of terror you can pull up. People ask later if we saw prints, or if the deer had been mauled, or if there was anything to bring back as proof. The truth is, I didn't go back, and my buddy didn't either. We were out of there. I still think about the deer laying ungathered on the leaf litter, and I think about the fact that whatever made that sound answered the moment it fell, and then kept up with us as we ran for the jeep. No bear I've ever watched would keep up like that without getting in your face. And a mountain lion would have done teeth and claws, and not that long drawn-out call. The sound was its own thing. That day, it ended with us sitting at a pump on Main Street, while the plain fluorescent lights hummed, and Jack poured some more coffee. We didn't go out to prove anything. We were too rattled for that. We both knew what we'd heard, and we didn't need anybody else to tell us it happened. Jack's words stayed with me because he didn't laugh or scoff. He just nodded and said he believed me, and that was enough to confirm that whatever had been out there wasn't a private hallucination. What gets me is how complete the memory is, and how incomplete the rest of it is. I can replay the steps, our walking, the deer, the shot, and I can play that call back in my head note for note. But there is no image that explains who or what was making it. I can picture the broken branches and the path we took out, the scrape across my car from a low branch, the way my buddy tugged my sleeve. I can picture Jack's face behind the counter, wiping his hands on a rag, the cigarette machine humming. But I can't picture the thing that made that sound. I have pieces, a branch snapped on the left, a shadow that might have been there for a second, but nothing I can point to and say, that is what it was. I tell people that lived through that day that the worst part wasn't the noise itself. It was the way the forest went back to being normal after we left. The noise stopped eventually, and the snapping slowed down, and nothing chased us into town. It was as if a switch had been turned off. You expect some perfect cinematic chase, something to explain itself in a grand finale, but it didn't do that. It got loud, it chased us away, and then it was gone. No final charge, no last look, nothing. I go back to Long's Lake sometimes, but never that stand of aspens. I know the hill well enough to know what a normal morning sounds like, and that day is not part of what a normal morning does. The memory has weight. It sits in my chest when I'm quiet, and it sneaks up on me when I'm alone in the truck. People throw out terms, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and I used to push back. But after Jack said, "I believe you," something in me stopped wanting to argue with a word and started wanting to understand how to keep myself safe. The sound is the hardest thing. It is a daytime sound, clear as the sun, and it is etched into me forever. I can't explain why it answered the deer falling like that, or why it kept pace with our run to the Jeep, or why it broke branches the way it did. I can't say what it looked like. I can only say what it did to me. It broke the ordinary. It put a hard edge on fear, and then it was gone. We drove off and didn't turn back. We told Jack and he said he believed us. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I swear I can hear that single drawn-out note again, exactly where it was, hanging there, and then nothing. It stops the way a light goes out. 1 second it's there, full and impossible, and the next second it just isn't. That cut is my favorite piece of the whole thing, and the worst. The sound comes, then it stops, and I'm left with a memory so loud that I can't make sense of the silence that follows. I still can't explain it. I can only tell it the way it happened, over and over in my head, and end on the same abrupt line it left me on. It screamed, and then it stopped. Story 2. I keep replaying that morning in my head because nothing about it fits. I had been hunting with Uncle Bill and Cousin Charles for years, same spot, same routine, and nothing in all those seasons prepared me for what I saw at Walton Creek campground the day we went up into the Root National Forest near Rabbit Ears Pass. We got there before sunrise, the kind of cold where your breath makes steady white lines and the truck windows fog up. Uncle Bill had the campsite sorted out quick like he always does. He's the kind of guy who knows how to tighten a tarp and make coffee without thinking about it. We loaded packs, checked ammo, shouldered rifles. I remember the sling of my rifle felt heavier than usual that morning. Maybe that's just how memory works. Small things gain weight after something bad happens. We pushed into a draw off the access road, following an elk trail that runs down toward a narrow canyon. The woods were the kind that crowd you in. Pines and scrub and a few old aspen mixed in. There's a rhythm to moving quiet with a couple of people. You match pace, you point when you see a scrape or a broken twig, you keep the chatter to a whisper. We used elk calls sometimes, but that day we were just trying to work a ridge where Uncle Bill thought a bull might be feeding. I heard the crack first, and everyone did. It wasn't a little twig snap. It was a clean, loud break from up ahead, like a heavy branch gave way under force. If you've hunted elk, you know that sound. Bulls will fight or rub antlers, and an elk can snap a sapling without much fuss. Our heads turned automatic. We moved toward it, quiet. We didn't know we were chasing the wrong thing until we were close. The canyon opens into a steep bowl on one side, a rocky slope on the other. We belly crawled to the lip of that canyon like idiots, thinking a bull would be down on the far edge or below in the brush. There was no elk, nothing that looked like one. For a second I thought it had been spooked and gone deeper, but then I saw movement on the far slope. And it wasn't moving like an elk or a deer or a bear. It was standing and climbing on two legs. I had my binoculars up first. I trained them and my stomach folded. It was black and messy like it hadn't seen a comb in years. It moved upright, hands free, using long, deliberate steps to claw up the slope between rocks and brush. I put my eye to the scope just because I had to know what I was looking at close up. That's when I got the face. Flat, no snout, thin lips pulled tight over a mouth that didn't look like it was built for tearing flesh or howling. Wide nostrils, broader than a man's nose, flared and dark. The eyes were black as coal and set under a heavy overhanging brow that threw a shadow down so I could only see two black pits. The whole head was wrong in a human way, and wrong in a way I can't put into any category. It wasn't a bear's face. It wasn't a deer, a mountain lion, nothing. It was like a human face that had been stretched and pressed into something else. For a moment, the thing half turned toward us, and I swear to you, that moment froze everything. Not because it roared or lunged, it didn't make a sound, but because it registered us. The shoulder turned, like it was trying to get a better angle to look, and when it did, it looked right at me through the scope. That gaze was the worst part. Not angry, not hungry, at least not in any way I could read. Just an appraisal, like someone checking what a weird object in the road is made of. I felt my knees go soft. Uncle Bill and Charles both made noises, not words. We were all right there, essentially pinned by the fact that whatever it was had seen us and hadn't run. There was a second or two where the canyon held still, like someone had paused the world. Time compresses in that window. You notice the light on a leaf. You notice the way a pine needle catches dust. It's like every part of you is waiting for the next thing to happen. And then, like a blink, it was gone. It disappeared into the trees on the far side with a speed that didn't match its size. I don't know how it did it. 1 second it was climbing, the next it had slipped between trunks and brush and just vanished. We sat there dumb, rifles slumped, listening for a sound that didn't come. After 5 minutes of frozen silence, we scrambled down into the canyon to follow. Maybe it was adrenaline, maybe pride, maybe it was the hunting instinct to not let a chance go. Chuck and Uncle Bill moved quick, not talking. We started to piece together where it had been when it came out of the brush. The first prints were obvious, if you know what to look for. Depressions that weren't cloven hoofs, not bare, but flat and long. We found a clear trackway as we followed the slope. The prints were enormous. I measured one with a tape we carry for packing measurements. You carry a tape because you'll measure antler spreads and stuff. And the length was about 40 centimeters. I remember because I said the number out loud and Uncle Bill went quiet. 40 centimeters is almost twice the size of a big human foot. The left foot, one of the impressions, had a missing little toe. It didn't just look like it was worn. The small toe impression wasn't there, like that toe didn't exist or had been damaged. The heel was deep, the ball of the foot pressed into the dirt, and the toes were long and spaced. The weight imprint was heavy. There was no dragging on the toes, like you might see with someone barefoot in soft soil. These were full, clear prints, spaced out, heading up and away into the thicker trees. Higher up the slope, we found broken branches at about 2 meters and 40 centimeters off the ground. I measured that too because that height told a story I couldn't ignore. Something tall had passed under those branches and pushed them down hard enough to snap. 2 meters and 40 centimeters is not a small reach. That's well above a normal man's shoulder when he raises his arm. As we moved, more branches snapped and scratches showed on the trunks where something had scrubbed by in a hurry. The tracks showed long strides, and the spacing between prints suggested a long-legged gait, like someone taking big, easy steps. Not a shuffle, not a human 2-footed strike in place. It was efficient and fast. We stayed with the prints for maybe 2 hours, inspecting, measuring, photographing with our phones. The light was getting toward the afternoon, and the hell of it was, there was a normalness under all this. Birds calling, a breeze in the pines, the occasional distant rumble from US 40. You could stand there and try to have a conversation about elk tags and deer seasons, but the words felt absurd in face of those prints. Charles kept glancing at me with this look that asked a question and had no answer. We went to find the forest ranger because you feel like you have to report something that's that out of place. We drove out to where a ranger had a little station along the highway and told him, as straight as we could, what we'd seen and what we'd measured. He put the report form down and leaned back and laughed. The kind of laugh that means he's not plotting anything, he just thinks it's funny. He made a joke about Bigfoot hunters and the kind of people who like to stretch twigs with big shoes to make fake prints. He asked if we'd been drinking or playing a prank, or if the prints might be someone's boots. He said he'd probably get a dozen calls like that, and that it was probably a prank. That's the thing that bothered me most, the absolute certainty in his voice that it was nonsense. The prints were not human boots. They had no heel ridge a boot leaves. They matched nothing I recognized. And the missing little toe. He shrugged like it was a mystery and said people sometimes break toes on rocks. He wrote down our names, asked us for the location in a way that suggested he thought we were wasting time, and then waved us off. The ridicule came out of nowhere and cut in a way I didn't expect. We left with the tape measure and the photos in our phones and a weird hollow in the place where I expected to feel reassurance. We didn't go back to the tracks after that. The day was long, and the thought of getting close to where it had been made me feel actively sick. I still sleep with the window cracked a little if I'm at home. The vision of it halfway up that slope, turning its shoulder and looking at me, I wake up with it. When you stand there with that kind of eye on you, a part of you learns something about being small in the world. The thing did not roar, it did not lunge, it didn't even break into a charge for us. It looked, weighed, and then moved away like we were just another piece of scenery. People ask why we didn't shoot. We could have tried. Uncle Bill had his rifle up for a second, but you don't fire into brush if you can't see what you're hitting. The thing had the grace of something older and stronger than we were, and in that little moment we were kids again, not ready and not willing to make a clean mistake. We stood and watched, and then it was gone. No blood or hair or anything left behind besides those prints and the snapped branches and a line of squashed underbrush. I've thought about going back alone at night or with others to try and follow further. I haven't. The prints are still there in the back of my mind, rotating slowly like a bad film reel. 30 feet across a creek bed. The broken twigs at 2 meters and 40 centimeters, the missing little toe on the left print. Those are specific pieces I can come back to like facts. They anchor the rest of the thing that seems like memory or imagination. The ranger's mocking voice is another fact. It's almost worse than outright denial, because it made us feel like liars in our own story. There's a small thing about the way it held itself that I can't shake. It was not hunched like a bear. It wasn't moving on all fours. Its shoulders were broader than a man's and the arms hung long. When it turned its shoulder in that canyon, the movement was controlled, precise, like someone practiced in walking upright in rough terrain. The look in its eyes under that heavy brow, cold and simple and registering, is something I still feel in the back of my neck. We drove back down US 40 that day, slow and quiet. The highway hum was the only sound in the truck. We didn't talk much, and when we did, it was about mundane things. Getting gas where we'd stopped for food, not about what had happened. I guess we both felt like saying it out loud would make it real in a way we weren't ready to accept. We left the canyon and the prints and whatever else that thing was and tried to let the day go, but things like that don't go. They hang. I tell you all this because I want you to understand the scale of what we saw and the feeling. You build a life out of repeated ordinary things, and then one event slices through and rearranges everything. I'm not saying ghosts or monsters. I'm saying a big bipedal creature moved through the Route National Forest that day. We watched it. We measured its prints. We told someone paid to listen, and he laughed. That makes you question your own eyes. The final image I have of it is stuck in my chest. A black shape half hidden among pines, shoulder turned like a person checking a road, and those eyes looking straight at me like they were cataloguing the small things that move through their land. Then it took one long step, and the trees swallowed it. No noise, no collapse of branches, just the regular, ordinary hush of the forest, returning as if nothing had happened. I still can't explain why it stopped when it did, or why it moved away so fast. We were left with prints and broken branches, and the feeling that we had been sized up and found interesting enough to note, but not interesting enough to follow. I go back sometimes, driving past Rabbit Ears Pass on US 40 and looking into the lines of trees, half expecting to see it on a ridge, half terrified I'll actually see it. I haven't, but the memory is there, larger than anything else from that day. It's not that I'm convinced of what it was in a textbook way. I'm convinced because I looked into something's face and it looked back. It turned its shoulder, stared at me, and then it was gone. I still can't explain it. Story 3. I can still see that hill, clear as a picture, the way the sun hit the rocks and how the water on Clear Creek Reservoir flashed down below. We climbed the slope north of the reservoir that day, the 4 of us cousins, with nothing planned but to roll rocks and eat whatever sandwiches the adults had left in the camp cooler. It was summer, hot enough to make the dirt powdery and the dust come off our sneakers in little puffs when we ran. We'd done that hill a dozen times, same path, same rocks that loosened if you kicked them right. It felt like one of those ordinary afternoons that never meant anything until it did. The top of that little ridge looks straight out over a bowl of aspens on the far side. The trees make this kind of wall of pale trunks and trembling leaves that always looks like it's moving, even when the air is still. We were up on that ridge, close to the edge, pushing stones the size of softballs and baseballs. We'd shove the bigger ones and watch them tumble, hearing them hit smaller rocks and throw up a sound that rolled down into the valley. That's normal kid stuff. You make noise and see chaos in small, controlled ways. The reservoir was a bright blue smear below us, and Granite's little cluster of cabins was somewhere on the far edge of that water. You could hear the adults at camp talking, and a distant engine from someone on the lake, but it all felt miles away. We were laughing and daring each other, and then, all at once, the rolling stopped because a heavy movement crossed the aspens on the other side. It wasn't a rustle like wind. It was a whole body motion that made the leaves part. I remember us all going quiet the same second. It was a weird reflex. 1 second you're ready to shove a rock over the lip, and the next your hands are cold and you're not even breathing properly. Nobody said a word. I remember feeling the dirt under my shoes go from grainy to solid, like the world had tightened. The thing that showed itself wasn't small. It walked upright on two legs. It was set back on the slope, half hidden by the trunks, but I saw enough to know it was not a deer or a moose or any bear I'd ever seen. It was tall, about 2 meters and 40 centimeters tall, if I had to put a number on it now. The sun caught on its fur and made it look brown golden, not the flat brown of a bear that's been rolling in dirt, but a sheen like the fur had different tones in it. Its shoulders were broad, the arms hung long, past where a man's elbows would fall. It wasn't hunched forward like a bear sometimes stands when it sniffs. It was upright and kind of deliberate in how it moved. What got to me was how it swayed, not like it was about to fall, but like it was trying to see clearer through the leaves. You could tell it was measuring us, checking who we were or what we were doing up there. The whole valley went quieter in those seconds. The usual sounds seemed to stop on their own. I could hear my heart loud in my ears. I remember the smell of hot resin from the pine poking up the slope, and even that felt like background. The aspen leaves, which had been flickering a little earlier, went still. We were frozen because we were kids, but also because there was this thing across the way that had the posture of something that had learned upright posture and used it naturally. Nobody rolled another rock. That was something I still think about. We'd been ready to send a boulder tumbling a second before, and then not one of us moved. I think we expected some sound, some clumsy noise that would make us laugh and call it a bear and go on with the afternoon. But there was no sound. It didn't snap a limb. It didn't cough. It stayed there, swaying once or twice, and then looking like it tried to see better, as if the leaves were in its eyes. I remember wanting to make a joke, the stupid little kid reaction to break the tension, but the laugh never formed because my throat had closed up. Then suddenly the whole thing hit us. It was like someone flipped a switch in all four of us at once. Terror, sharp and stupid and immediate, broke through. We dropped the rock we had ready and ran. The slope was loose. There's a layer of crumbly shale and gravel on that side, and your feet always slide if you don't watch where you put them. I remember the sound of our sneakers skidding and the dirt spraying up. My knees took the worst of it, scraped and bleeding a little where the dirt ground in. One of my cousins went down hard and came up coughing dust, and the other two were already past him, hauling on his sleeve to get him moving. We tumbled and spun, grabbed at saplings and ledges, and kept going until we hit the flatter ground by the old fire pit where the adults had set up chairs. It felt ridiculous in the moment, terrible and ridiculous both. We were shaking and spitting dust out of our mouths, and the adult who was nearest looked up like we'd just seen a deer or a coyote and said, "Not to worry." I can still see the way she set the butter knife down on the cooler and said the thing adults always do to kids when they know something spooky will make the rest of the day uncomfortable. Probably just a bear. She said it almost like it was a thing that would explain everything and get us to calm down. The other adults mumbled the same and went back to their sandwiches and chairs. They mean well, but their voices had that flat, make-it-not-weird tone. I remember being furious then, not at the adults, but at how quick their answer was. I wanted to shout that I knew what a bear looked like, because I did. I'd seen bears on that reservoir's far side before, lumbering low and making a mess of berry patches. Bears have necks and snouts, and they move in a certain clumsy way when they stand. They don't hold themselves upright with broad, boxy shoulders and arms that hang past normal elbows like I'd seen. Bears can stand on their hind legs to look, sure, but they don't have that long-limbed, loose-bodied stance the thing had. And their fur is different, dirtier, less layered, not shining like that in the sun. This was not something that looks at you as a bear looks at you. It was a presence up there, measuring us from above. And that feeling of being small in someone else's gaze is a sharp, primitive thing that I still feel when I think about it. The adults went back to their normal adult stuff. Coffee, arguing over where to put the cooler, folding a blanket, and we tried to tell ourselves the same thing they were saying, even though our knees still throbbed. You can see how a memory starts to split in two right there. The version the adults accept and the version the kids keep. We kept seeing the broad shoulders, the way the sun drew streaks in the fur, the slight sway. The memory narrowed down to those small details because the rest was just a blur of feet and dirt and breath. After a while, and after the cuts on our knees had bled down and someone had said we should be careful, we all tried to act normal. We ate the sandwiches, but none of us wanted to go back up the ridge. We sat and kicked at the dirt and watched the aspens on the far side as if expecting it to step out again. If you've ever been a kid and had something scary happen, you know the way the world after that is a copy of itself but thin, like the colors have been washed out. Small noises prick you. The breeze that used to be pleasant felt suspicious. Every shadow in the trees got more attention than it deserved. I didn't go back up that slope during that trip. Later that week we left the camp and life moved on. But that thing stayed with me in a way that other camp stories don't. When you're little and something big and unknown has looked at you and then turned away, there's a kind of terror that sits in your ribs. It wasn't about a movie monster or a story someone told. It was about being measured by something that was not part of the normal cast of animals I'd learned about. That's still the way I think about it, measured. Like whatever it was had counted us as part of the scenery for a second to see if we were worth noting. Over the years, I told bits of that day to friends and a few family members. Some of them blamed our imagination or the heat, or the way aspens move so that you can accidentally see shapes in them. Maybe some of that is true, but the details are stubborn. The height, the way the fur caught the light, the long arms, the sway, that sticks. Facts like scraped knees and sand in my mouth and the adults folding blankets after saying, "must be a bear," are still facts. They're not explained by imagination. Sometimes when I drive that road past Leadville toward Granite, I find myself looking up toward the north face of the reservoir without meaning to. The slope looks smaller from the car, of course. The aspens look thinner and the rocks look like they've settled into the earth. I always tell myself I don't want to scare the cousins. We're older now. Life is rounder in responsibilities. But there's a part of me that's careful. I park my car and listen for no good reason. I listen to the way the leaves whisper and wonder how much of being a kid is just being open to being scared, and how much is seeing something real and having no way to fold it into the world adults insist on. If you ask me now whether it was a bear, I'll tell you no. If you ask whether it was a person in a suit or someone messing with us, I'll say no again. The distance was too far for a prank to make sense, and the thing moved too easily over that slope for someone with a costume. It didn't look like an animal I recognized. And that's the worst kind of real, something that doesn't match your list of known things. That presence up there watching was not merely an animal in the way a coyote or a deer is an animal. It had a composure to it that suggested a being comfortable being upright and scanning its territory. I try not to dramatize it. I don't want to tell some great eerie tale. It's a memory that keeps cropping up, the way a loose thread catches on a nail. The fear it left behind is not constant, but it's precise. There are times when the wind slips through a row of aspens and my skin goes cold the same way it did that afternoon. There's a small muscle in my throat that tightens because my body remembers the speed of our run down that slope. The scraped knees light up in my mind like they happened yesterday. That day at Clear Creek Reservoir started out ordinary. Kids on a hill, hot sun, stones to shove. It ended with something up on the far slope holding still, looking, and us breaking into a run. The adults said what adults say to calm kids. Mostly that it was a bear. I know what a bear is. What I saw was not that. What I keep coming back to is the image of that thing swaying and peering through the leaves, its fur flashing brown gold in the light, measuring us from high above until we dropped our games and fled. And then, suddenly, the moment after we were down and bleeding and breathless, it was as if the world flipped back to ordinary. No proof, no follow-up, no answer, just our dirty knees, and the adults folding blankets and saying it was probably nothing. That's where it sits now, a hard slice of a day with no wrap-up. We had a scare, we ran, the adults dismissed it, and the thing stood there on that slope like one of the trees, and then stopped being visible. I still can't explain why it was there that afternoon, or what it was doing watching a bunch of kids roll rocks. I only know what it felt like to be on the receiving end of that attention, and that feeling ends as abruptly in my memory as it did in real life. One moment measuring us, the next moment gone, and me left trying to put the rest of the world back together around that blank. Story 4. I remember that hike like it happened yesterday, even though it was years ago. It was a summer day in the Rawa Wilderness, up inside the Roosevelt National Forest near Steamboat Springs. Me and 2 friends had broken away from the main trail to cut across an alpine meadow that sits just above the tree line. It was the kind of place you go to because it looks empty and wide and safe. Pale grasses, small pockets of lingering snow, the kind of sunlight that makes you squint and wish you'd put on sunglasses. We were carrying day packs, water, a sandwich or 2, nothing heavy. We weren't trying to find anything. We were just moving through country we liked. The air up there is different. It's thin and clean, and it makes your lungs work harder without you noticing, until you make a big step and your chest complains. I remember feeling that little burn in my ribs as we walked. The ground was a mix of crushed rock and short alpine grass, and there were patches of snow that hung on in the hollows. In summer, you expect the snow to be soft and dirty, half melted, but that morning the patches were still hard and bright in the sun, like someone had left plates of white in the grass. I don't know if it had frozen overnight or if it was a reef of old snow that just never melts, but the edges were crisp. We were joking and throwing small rocks, the easy way people make time pass on a hike, when one of us stopped and pointed. I'm not good with timing on things. People always think they saw something first, but that pause is in my memory like a photograph, all 3 of us going quiet at once. We stepped closer, and that's when I saw the first print. At first I thought it was a boot print. It was sunk into the snow and had a shape, but it didn't have the pattern of a sole. It was an imprint of a bare foot. Not just a bare foot, a human-shaped foot. Heel, ball, arch, 5 toes pressed in like someone had been standing there with bare skin on snow. I knelt down because it's what you do when you see tracks. You study them. The definition was ridiculous. The toes were carved in sharp and separate, the heel pushed in deep. There was no melting or slurring to the edges. It looked like whoever made it had stepped down on the snow that morning and lifted cleanly, leaving a perfect negative of the skin. We checked the others. There was a line of them that stepped from patch to patch across the meadow, one after another, foot on snow, then the next foot on the next patch, no prints in between. At first I thought it might be a hiker who had removed their boots to cool their feet and walked across the remaining snow. That's what anyone sane would lean toward. But then I noticed details that didn't fit that explanation. First thing, the size. My hiking boots are not small, and I know what they look like in the dirt. I put the toe of my boot into one of the prints just to compare. The print swallowed my boot by a noticeable margin. It was long, maybe about 14 inches from heel to big toe by my quick guess, and wide across the ball. The toes were spaced and slightly splayed like a barefoot person who spreads them on a surface, not cramped together like toes inside shoes. The proportion was wrong for a human foot. Second thing, the stride. The distance between one print and the matching print on the other side was enormous. I tried to put my trekking pole across the interval to get a sense of it, and that didn't help. We stood there and measured rough lengths with our hands. The steps were far bigger than anything we could manage comfortably. More like a long, easy stride from a very tall person who walks with long legs or something else entirely. And then the part that made my skin go cold. Between the snow patches there was nothing, not a smudge on the grass, not the sideways drag you sometimes see where a foot slips, not a bent blade of grass. The ground between the patches looked untouched. If you asked me to draw it, I'd draw perfect little stepping spots of snow across a clean field, and a line of huge bare prints sitting only in those white spots. Whoever or whatever had crossed that meadow had stepped exclusively on the snow. We laughed at first with the stupid bravado people put on when nerves spike. Someone with a big foot, a prank, that kind of thing, but it was thin. The more I looked, the sicker my stomach felt. It wasn't logic that knocked me, it was a gut reaction, a temperature drop at the base of the neck. I tried to imagine how someone could have done it. Could a human jump that distance from patch to patch without touching the grass? Maybe if they made big leaps and landed cleanly. I tried to stand where one print was and lunge with both legs to the next patch and almost wiped out. My friends tried too. We couldn't do it with our boots, not without a running start and a flat landing area. This was not a plausible route for a normal walker. We took pictures. Our phones' cameras seemed small and inadequate against the clarity of the prints. One of my friends set a water bottle across the print to show scale, and I remember swearing because the bottle looked childish next to the depth of the impression. The heel was pressed in, as if weight had been centered there, and the toes were splayed and distinct. There were tiny ridges at the ball of the foot where it seemed the skin had left a pattern in the snow. It had the look of a bare sole imprint, not something made with a tool or a boot. That brought up the idea of a prank, and we spent a few minutes trying to poke holes in that possibility. There was no trail nearby, and we were a long walk from the nearest trailhead. We had passed no other people that morning. If someone had come through and staged this, they'd have had to carry a mold or remove boots and walk barefoot without leaving a smear on the grass between the patches. It didn't add up. Also, the edges of the prints were too clean for an old prank. Fake prints tend to smear or have odd tool marks. These were crisp and consistent. As we argued quietly, the meadow seemed to rearrange itself into attention. Birds that had been twittering a little earlier went silent. The breeze off the nearby ridge fell away. I remember looking at my friends and seeing the same blank expression on both faces. The same sudden awareness that we had no real story to fit this into. We followed the line, careful where we stepped, because you don't want to trample evidence when you're the one who found it. The prints went across the meadow in a straight band, stepping from one patch of snow to the next with a regular rhythm until they reached the lip where the meadow sloped down toward a stand of low pines. There, at the edge of the last patch, the line ended. It was the abruptness of that ending that did more to me than the prints themselves. The last print sat on the snow right at the divide between snow and grass, perfect as the others, and then nothing on the ground beyond. The prints didn't continue into the trees. They stopped like someone stepping off a scale or walking off a map. I stood there facing that last impression and felt something like vertigo. Not physical, but the mental kind where the world seems to have a hole in it. It was the unmistakable sense of being given one piece of information with everything else missing. We talked about following the line into the trees, about trying to find some other sign higher up or lower down, but my legs had turned to rubber. Something in the forest felt different. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe the altitude was getting to me. But when my friend took a step toward the pines, a squirrel burst out of a bush, and the noise shocked us. It was such a small thing, and yet it felt like an alarm bell. We backed away and sat on a rock for a long time. I kept telling myself we should go back to the car and get somebody who knew about tracks to look at the pictures. We joked about calling the ranger, but there was no cell reception where we were, and the nearest human for miles was a vague idea in the distance. The practical part of my brain tried to catalog options, photograph everything, mark the location on the map, go to the trailhead. The part of me that was feeling that cold churn in my stomach just wanted to put distance between me and that meadow. We left without doing a proper analysis. That feels childish to admit now, but it is the truth. We walked back across the field in silence, and I kept throwing quick glances over my shoulder, half expecting to see another line of prints or something, shaped like a person watching us from behind a tree. We didn't look at our photos much on the hike back. Our hands felt sticky and strange, and the idea of looking at our proof made the image more real. We reached the tree line, and the noise of the day came back a little. A motorcycle on the distant road, a chipmunk, the rustle of packs as we shouldered them. Those ordinary sounds were brutal in their normality because they made the print feel like an intrusion on a world that had a script for how things were supposed to be. When we finally reached the trailhead and got to where there was cell service, I texted one of my buddies who knows tracks and sent the pictures. He asked blunt questions: foot length, stride, depth. I typed replies and then stopped because I couldn't give him more than what we had: pictures and a direction. He said he'd look at them and tell me if someone had been screwing with us. He called not long after, and his voice broke into mine. Those do not look like someone in boots. He tried to be rational, listing possibilities. That made us feel marginally better and marginally worse at the same time. If it was not boots, then what? A barefoot human, an animal, some kind of weather trick. None of the answers stuck. People have asked me later why we didn't go back. The honest answer is that we did not have the nerve. I kept trying to make it mean something normal, maybe a prank, maybe a hiker who had warmed his feet and limped away. I tried to picture any sane human removing boots and wandering across a remote alpine meadow, stepping only on snow patches with such regularity that the ground between remained untouched. It didn't fit a human story. The more I turned it over, the more uneasy the picture got. A couple of sleepless nights after that hike, I imagined all sorts of scenarios. I imagined somebody out there who could walk on anything and leave no trace. I imagined a person with enormous feet traveling in some way we couldn't see. That sick feeling in my stomach wasn't just fear, it was a baffled bruise. The sense that you had been presented with evidence that your map of the world was missing a road. It's a stupid phrase, but accurate. I felt like I had a memory of something that I couldn't prove to anyone because all I had were pictures and a story. Pictures that you can always say are staged, a story that sounds like a camp tale. I went back to that area once, months later, with someone who knew how to do proper track work. We hiked as far as the meadow, and the snow patches were shrunken then, but there were no fresh prints, nothing in the grass that suggested something had walked there recently. Time, weather, and the small life of that place had erased any trace. The only thing that remained was the memory in my head of that one line of perfect, enormous barefoot prints stopping dead at the tree line. That was the part that never made sense and never stopped pricking at me. Sometimes I try to think of a conclusion that fixes everything. Maybe an artist had come up and made impressions for art's sake. Maybe someone was playing a prank and marched in bare feet with a measure tape and perfect timing. Maybe it was just my mind seeing a familiar shape and making too much of it. I put my hands on plausible answers and they slip away like wet gloves. The facts that stay are stubborn. The prints looked like human feet, only much larger. They were crisp and clean in the snow. They landed only on snow patches. They ended without explanation. I still drive past Roosevelt National Forest and look across at the places where the meadow lies. The thought of going back alone makes my chest tighten. The day we found those tracks started ordinary and then pivoted on a single thing that didn't make sense. It wasn't loud, it wasn't violent. It was quiet and precise and then gone. That's what unsettles me most. A line of impressions that told a story and then refused to finish it. We walked away and the meadow stayed the same, the sky the same blue. But the place lost a kind of innocence for me. When I try to describe the last image I have, the one that still wakes me up sometimes, it's the last footprint sitting at the edge of the snow like a stamp, perfect and alone. and then the empty grass beyond it. I can't explain why it ends there. I can't explain why the creature, person or thing would choose to step only on snow patches. I can only say what happened in as plain a way as I can. I saw a line of enormous, bare, human-shaped footprints in summer snow across a high meadow in the Rawa wilderness. They were crisp. They were too big to belong to any person I could imagine. They stepped only on snow, and they stopped. That final stop is what sits in my head. A clean end point with no follow-up. To this day, I can't explain it, and that not knowing is the part that still makes my stomach turn. Story 5. I still can't shake that night. We lived in a tiny cabin partway up the Sugarloaf slope, the kind of place that feels like an afterthought pushed into the trees. It had one main room, a little kitchen, a rusted wood stove that rattled when the wind hit it right, and a loft where the beds were. My son slept on the top bunk right under a small square window that looked out over the north face and into the pines. The window was the size of a bathroom mirror, low to the roofline, so when you climbed up, you were almost eye level with the trunks on the slope outside if you stood up. That little detail is why everything about that night stuck with me, because of the view from the bunk and how the slope changed what you could see when someone was outside. It had been a long day of doing odds and ends around the cabin. We'd kept the stove going, and I'd been in and out fixing a porch board and stacking a few logs. The sky went dark early behind those ridges, and once the light dropped, the woods took on that quiet that makes your ears feel too loud. My son was already in bed, reading a flashlight book under the thin blanket like he always did when we stayed up there. We had our routine, a quick dinner, a scrub of dishes, a cup of tea, and then everyone up the ladder and out of the living room noise. That night I remember thinking how normal things were. Normal turned out to be the worst kind of setup. It was after 11 o'clock at night when it happened. I was in the kitchen washing a pan, and there was that low, steady wind that comes down off the summit. It rattled pine needles against the north wall and made the stove whistle a little. All of a sudden a sound came from the loft, not from outside the cabin, but from my son on the top bunk. A small noise at first, like a nervous intake of breath, and then a word yanked out of him in the kind of voice that is half scream and half pure animal alarm. He yelled, and the word was raw. "Mon!" And then it cut into a full scream I have never heard before. It was the kind of scream that doesn't sound like a kid playing at being scared. It was a scream that split the night and sent me up the ladder so fast I knocked my knee on the rung. When I reached the loft, he was sitting bolt upright, sheets tangled at his waist, eyes wide and filling with a look that isn't something you can fake. He kept saying it over and over like a broken record. A monster out there. His voice was thin and small, and he kept pointing at the little window with his finger, trembling. He kept saying it even as I pulled him close. You can argue about the way kids imagine things and sometimes make a drama out of a shadow, but this was not that. His hands were cold and shaking, and his face had that rawness that comes from a real shock. I had never seen him like that. He told me what he'd heard first, a deep hoo or howl, he tried to describe it. He said it sounded like someone making a call, low and long, and then footsteps and leaves rustling very close to the cabin. He said he looked out the small window and saw something dark and very big standing near the trunks, its eyes shining in the light from the stove and the moon. He kept saying the eyes were shining, that they glinted like something wet in the dark, and that it looked straight into the window at him. He said it looked at him, and then he screamed. He didn't even finish a full sentence before the sound bled into another repeated word. A monster. He kept saying it like he couldn't find any other way to explain what he had seen. I hugged him and told him it would be okay, and that we'd go out and check, because what else do? You go check. You want to know what's out there. I climbed down the ladder, grabbed my flashlight and a small folding hatchet because that's what we always left by the door. The night air hit me hard when I opened the door, cold and resin-heavy from the pines. The slope outside the cabin drops away, so the ground at the north wall sits a couple of meters below the level of the loft window. That's important because of the angle you look through the window. If something was standing on the ground at the base of the slope and could look straight into the top bunk at eye level, that thing would have to be tall. I held the flashlight steady and thought through the geometry like I always do when my brain goes into the practical mode. The height of the window, the drop from the loft to the ground, the slope's angle. By my reckoning, it would need to be about 2 meters and 10 centimeters to 2 meters and 40 centimeters tall to meet that sightline. I can't explain why I did the math then. It's just the thing you do in the dark, trying to make sense. I walked the perimeter slow, light on the deck and then off the porch and down the short flight of steps to the north side. The pine needle floor there is soft, a thick carpet that muffles your steps. I swept the flashlight beam across the trunks, across the base of the trees where branches and needles pile up like someone had raked them into a blanket. The beam caught on everything. A rabbit's eye reflected red 2 yards away and then disappeared. A raccoon might have rustled down in a lower branch, and somewhere an owl moved off with the lazy flap of big wings. I checked under some low boughs and around the old root tangle where a coyote sometimes scents and marks. I expected fur or scat or footprints, anything that says another animal was near. There was nothing at all. The pine needles were undisturbed, lying in their usual random pattern. There were no prints pressed into that soft mat, no broken twigs in a path, no damp soil where a heavy body had been. The whole ground looked as if no one had walked there in days. I told myself that meant the monster must have been a shadow, a reflection, a trick of the flashlight or the moonlight that my son had spooked, and the mind had filled the rest. I looked up through the trees, trying to see if maybe a deer had climbed partway up the slope, or if an elk had stood on a rise where the angle would let it meet the window. Nothing, just trunks and a sky full of stars. I went back inside because that's what you do when you swim in nothing and need to put yourself back into the small, warm bubble of your house. My son kept muttering about the eyes, the way they caught the light. He said they were bright, shiny, like somebody had polished them. He kept repeating the same few words like a mantra. Big, dark, eyes shined. He drew a shaky little circle in the air with his finger, like he was trying to show me how big the head looked through the window. I sat on the edge of his bed and tried to calm him, to make him count or breathe or think about something else. I'm good at pretending for kids. I can make a voice that says everything is fine. But that night, my voice felt thin. We sat up for a while with the stove low and the little cabin lights on. Every sound outside, a branch settling, a pine cone striking the deck, even the whisper of wind rubbing the north wall, made his shoulders jump. At one point, he asked me to move his blanket up because he said the window looked like a pair of eyes might slide along the glass. I pulled the blanket high and told him a story about a bear that hibernates under a rock, which is the kind of small lie you tell because the truth is bigger than anyone can handle. He kept asking if I had seen it, and I kept answering that I saw nothing. He didn't believe me. You can see why. The look on his face was carved from something that sits in the chest and doesn't go away. Eventually, the adrenaline wore into a shaky, tired, and we tried to sleep. I set the flashlight near the stair and left the door cracked a little because I wanted to be ready. I took the top half of the blanket and lay there listening. My body was busy making lists of practical things. Check the traps in the morning, make sure the stove chimney isn't blocked, ask the neighbor if he'd seen anything when he was up earlier that day. Those things are normal, and they were my attempt at normal. But underlying that was a sensation like someone had put a hand on the center of my chest and was holding me down. Small, steady dread. At some point in the night, I don't know how long had passed because sleep came in starts and stops, I heard it again, not through the window, but from somewhere near the north wall. It was the same low call my son had tried to mimic, that deep hoo that hung and trailed off like someone holding a note. It was soft but carried, like the sound was coming from under the trees and trying to find a break in the wood to get through. My heart did a stupid thing and jumped up into my throat. I sat bolt upright, every muscle wired. My first thought was to get up and go see. My second thought was my son curled under the blanket and the stupid smallness of the cabin. And then the call stopped. The silence after it stopped was worse than the sound. It was a quiet that had weight, a heavy lid closing. I could hear my breathing and the stove ticking and the small settling noises of a house like a living thing. The wind at the north wall went back to its normal whisper, but every whisper since then has had a shape for me. Every time the pine needles brush the siding, I hear that same low patience in it, like something waiting and knowing where the windows are. My ears have become traitors because they make a harmless sound into an immediate threat. I want to be clear about something. I looked for proof. I went out and scanned. The ground was clean. I could not find a hair, a print, a smudge, nothing that would say, yes, this thing had been right here. The boy's panic was not made up. He showed me that with the look on his face and the shake in his hands. I can't explain why that is a more reliable proof than anything I could find on the ground. It doesn't make sense on paper. It made sense in the loft with the tiny window and the raw face of my kid and the exact geometry of a thing that would have to be tall to peer through that glass. We stayed up the rest of the night like that. Windows closed, light low, stove faint. I kept checking the door and peeking out the cracks, and every time I did, it felt like I was trespassing on something. My son finally slept around the small hours. I couldn't tell you exactly when, only that it was late and the light had gone oil dark. And when he did, he dreamed fitfully, muttering the word monster in his sleep. I lay there looking at the dark ceiling and thinking of measurements and eyes and the slope. I thought of how obvious things look when you change your vantage point. The slope made the world weird in a way I had never paid attention to before. By the time morning started to thread light between the trees, I had convinced myself of a dozen explanations. A neighbor with a flashlight playing a joke, a raccoon with reflective eyes in a bad place, my son's imagination. Each one fit a little less well as I turned it over. You can't force a memory back into its original box once it's out. That night stays out. It moved into a place in me that makes the northern wall of the cabin a live thing. Every wind at that side sounds like the same being waiting, invisible, maybe just outside, maybe not. And there's nothing sane I can point to that tells me otherwise. I am not writing this to make a horror out of a shadow. I'm writing this because the look on my son's face that night was not something you make up. His voice, the way he kept saying, a monster, his description of eyes that shone, those are the pieces that sit with me. I went out and checked. The pine needle floor showed nothing, no tracks, no broken branches, nothing to explain how a thing could stand so near the window and be seen and leave no trace. We stayed inside, and the call, that low, long pitch, hung in my ears in certain gusts of wind, as if it had been recorded in the wood of the house. The last thing that happened that night was how it stopped. 1 minute, there was that low, patient sound folded into the night, and the next minute, it dissolved like a thread cut clean, leaving a silence so complete it felt like the room itself had been swallowed. There was no final charge, no crash, no shadow looming at the door. There was nothing except us in a cabin on a slope, trying to explain what our ears and eyes had already told us. I can't explain it. I still don't know what my son saw through that small window, only that he saw something that made him scream like nothing else ever has, and that whatever it was stood where it needed to stand to look straight up at him. Then, like a conversation cut short, It stopped. It just stopped, and I have been unable to close that sentence ever since. Story 6. I think about that morning more than I should. I was a student at the University of Denver then, and it was one of those weekend trips we did to clear our heads between classes. A simple hike into Lost Creek wilderness, just me and my girlfriend. Nothing complicated. We left the car early, the kind of clear morning where the air feels like it was rinsed overnight and everything looks sharper. The plan was to drop down to a small lake I'd heard about from someone in a class. A quiet spot to sit, eat, and get away from the city noise from. It was supposed to be an easy, calm day. The trail down was steep in parts, with those loose, rocky sections that force you to watch every foot. There were stretches of pine and pockets of scrub, some open granite, and when we broke out above the bowl where the lake sits, you get that sudden view. Water, trees around it, a little beach of stones. The sun hit the surface, and sometimes the glare makes it hard to see detail unless you shade your eyes. We were both carrying light packs, a couple of sandwiches, my cheap point-and-shoot camera and cell phones. We were light and casual. We had no reason to expect anything odd. We were maybe a little more than a short walk from the shore when we saw a figure crouched on the far bank. I can still get that distance in my head, about 30 meters ahead, maybe more. Close enough to make out a shape, but far enough that you don't immediately know if you've recognized it. At first, I thought someone had come down before us and was sitting on the rocks. You get used to seeing day hikers or fishermen in places like that. So we slowed and dropped our voices to whisper, more curiosity than alarm. The water made that thin, constant noise against the stones. A small wind threaded the pines, and everything felt ordinary. Then it stood up. I'll say right away that the way it rose into a full standing posture is the image that burned the most into me. It wasn't like watching a person stand up. It unfolded in a way that filled space fast and made you feel physically smaller by comparison. It straightened from that low position into a tall, broad shape. Its shoulders were wide, the torso thick. The whole thing was covered in dark hair that didn't look like fur on an animal I knew. It was coarse and glossy where the sun caught it, almost black, but with a sheen like oil. When it became fully upright, it was obvious in a way I can't explain. It was not a bear on hind legs or a moose or any animal that fits the normal list. It had a posture that read like someone used to being upright. We didn't scream. I think that's where this memory gets strange for me. It wasn't a scream first reaction. It was more like the world compressed. My entire body went to a steady, raw panic that had no sound, like someone flipped off every background noise and left a single loud fear. My girlfriend and I both froze. Our feet were planted, our mouths dry, and somehow my hands tightened on the straps of my pack without me thinking about it. I remember being aware of the heat under my collar and the taste of the cold air in my mouth like I'd been holding it. It's that weird sensation when your body decides it needs to do something and your brain can't agree yet on which thing. The figure looked at us. I don't know how to describe the look beyond that it was a look. It registered us, and there was the exact moment when I felt seen in a way I had never felt before. Not singled out, not loud or threatening, but acknowledged. It was like being measured. Everything tightened in my chest. There was no growl, no sound at all but the water. The only thing that made the moment real was that it turned its head and its face held still for those seconds. I could see the dark of its eyes in the hollow of its face when the sun hit at that angle. They were not reflective like a deer's eyes. I didn't get a clear look at the whole face because of distance and the thing's obvious size. What I got was a reading, tall, broad, and covered in dark hair, and it was looking at us. That look did something to me that nothing else has. It wasn't the cinematic terror you see in movies where people shout and run. It was a pure old panic that turned my heart into a drum in my ears. I felt smaller in a physical way, like air pushing down. Even though I didn't move, I felt my legs as if they had become distant parts of my body you could only notice when they failed. My girlfriend didn't run either. We both stood there, breaths shallow. The lake's ripple kept going like the world hadn't changed at all, but everything between us and that shoreline felt like a tight rope. And then, almost without a seam, it turned and vanished into the tree line. Not a crash, not a bounding rush. It just shifted and was gone. One moment we were locked in that mutual stare, and the next there was nothing on the shoreline but the water and those rocks. No sound of heavy feet through brush, nothing to mark its exit. I remember the small detail of watching a leaf fall from a nearby pine and thinking, no, I didn't imagine it. Something had been there and had seen us. We both inhaled at the same moment, like someone had released us from holding our breath. Both of us were breathless in a way that felt like we had been underwater and just surfaced. For a while after that, we just sat on a flat rock and stared. We didn't say anything useful. The thing that eats at me is not the physical description, the height, the hair, the breadth. It's that the presence did not behave like any animal I know. Bears make sounds, they snort or run, or you hear the crack of a branch. A mountain lion's movement is different. It would have slipped quietly into cover but not stood upright and look. This standing, broad-shouldered look at us was not in the book of regular wilderness encounters. All those facts stack up and make you doubt yourself. You keep trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a person. Maybe we were seeing a camera trick or an illusion of light on a pile of logs. But none of those explanations fit with how we both felt in our gut. We did what people do when they can't accept a single strange moment and need more evidence. We came back. Over the next 2 weekends, we returned with friends and with cameras. We took coordinates. We walked the shoreline with more care. We left simple trail cams up in trees for a few days. We tried to set up an angle where we could get a clear shot across the water. We dragged lines through the brush looking for sign, broken branches, footprints, anything. We sat in hideouts in case it came back during dawn or dusk. We did all the things you think would settle it down and prove the story true or false. Nothing. No prints in the wet shoreline that made sense. No tuft of hair caught on a branch. No twigs snapped in a way that said a heavy creature passed. The trail cams were left for days and sometimes recorded deer or small mammals, but nothing that fit what we'd seen. One camera picked up a fox at night and another caught a couple of birds checking out the lenses, but no large bipedal silhouette crossing the frame in daylight. We checked and rechecked the coordinates, compared photos, tried different vantage points. The shoreline looked ordinary. The water lapped the same way. The trees stood in the same pattern. It was maddening because the thing had been unmistakable in that single instant. That blankness doesn't make the memory less real. It makes it worse. Because if you find hair or footprints, you can do something with it. You can send a sample to somebody. You can measure. You can put the incident into a file where it has an answer. Finding nothing leaves you with that look and the 2 seconds when you were seen. It's like a sentence without a period, a loop that stays open in your chest. I went back and sat where we had sat, feeling the sun on my shoulders, watching the same angle of water, and still the skin on my arms would tighten. My friends were patient and practical. They tried to make sense of it. One of them suggested a hunter, another an elaborate prank. But they all agreed we should have found something if that were true. The cameras failing to catch anything is a small recurring puzzle. Over the years, that moment has cropped up in little ways. I'll be walking alone in the city, and my chest will lock for a second, and I'll realize I'm aware of shadows differently. I can't pretend it hasn't changed how I move in those places. I don't go down to that lake anymore alone. I don't take the easy path that drops down there. I watch the shoreline a lot when I'm near water. It's a stupid, specific thing to be careful about, but that instant of being looked at is stuck in me. It's a private, clumsy fear, not the stuff of dramatic story just the way you suddenly learn a place in your brain where you should not be casual. People have asked if we got any footage at all, or if I had a clearer picture to prove it. We got nothing useful. The photos I took the first day, I have them, are of the shoreline and the same rocks. Nothing unusual. They show normal trees and normal water. I've shown them to friends who look and say, there's nothing, and they're right, there isn't. Which is what makes me keep the memory as something personal rather than evidence. It's the opposite of the kind of thing you can build into a case. It's a solitary thing that sits in my head. I don't pretend to know what it was. I could list the reasons why it wasn't a bear or why it wasn't a person in a costume, but those arguments start to sound defensive after a while. The simple truth is this. I saw something that was upright, broad, dark-haired, and it looked at me, then slipped into the trees without a sound. I've tried to pin it down in measurable terms and failed. I've tried to forget it and failed. The lack of closure is the worst part. You come out of an experience like that with a weird hunger for a follow-up, like you'd want the world to finish a story. It started with you. The last time I was near that area, I parked the car and didn't go down to the lake. I stood on the ridge where you get the view and watched the same little band of trees, the same water glint. For a moment, I half expected to see a dark shape move there and for my body to do the old dumb freeze. It didn't happen, and I left without descending. To this day, when I tell the story, people ask why we didn't run or why we didn't take a photo in that instant. I don't have a good answer beyond saying that the old panic that hits in moments like that is not about logic. It's about a hard system in you that flips on and makes everything else less important. That's why we sat and breathed, and then why we left and why we returned, and why nothing fit together afterward. If anything about this story counts as proof, it's how persistent the memory is. For years after, I'd get this sudden recall. The shine on the dark hair where the morning hit it, the slow way it stood up, the exact feel of my gut folding. Those are the facts I carry. What I saw, where I saw it, and that when it looked at us, the world changed. It turned and vanished, and then everything quieted as if the day had simply moved on. We were breathless, like we'd been holding our breath, and then with nothing else to go on, we had to do what we could. Return with cameras, ask friends, look for damage, and leave still knowing only the memory of being seen. I still can't explain why that happened or why it left no trace. I only know that some mornings you can be two people walking toward a lake, and in the space of a look the world will change shape forever, and there will be no answer for why it did. Story 7. I still remember the way the moon lit up the ditch like someone had poured silver water into it. It was one of those nights out near Greeley in Weld County where the horizon is low and the sky takes over everything. We were 6 teenagers in an old 4-door that smelled like spilled soda and cigarette smoke from earlier that summer. Nothing fancy, just a car that got us where we wanted to go. We were driving slow on a back road, no one sober enough to be sensible, and someone had the stupid idea to switch the headlights off for a while because the moon was so bright. That's the kind of stupid that feels like a dare when you're young. The road was a narrow strip of blacktop with gravel shoulders and the irrigation ditch running parallel to it. If you've driven out that way, you know the ditch. Shallow banks, water that moves slow and sticky in places, a smell of algae and wet dirt that the wind pushes over the road now and then. The night had that dry edge smell you get in eastern Colorado, with a mild reek from the irrigated fields where they've been watering alfalfa and corn. Crickets were loud, and occasional frogs added to the chorus. We had been cutting the headlights for a while, feeling the moonlight and talking loud and stupid, and the radio was a low hum behind our voices. The driver flicked the switch back on without warning. Maybe he wanted to see the road ahead. Maybe he thought a passing car would catch us out. The light slammed the inside of the car like someone opened a window into daylight. That's when we saw it, Right there, a few yards ahead, something moving up out of the ditch and into the road like it belonged there. I don't have any reason to make this up, and I won't try to dress it up. I looked, and then I couldn't unsee the thing that filled the beam. It rose up as if the bank had been a pit and it had decided to step out. The body coming up was huge, not just tall, but thick and heavy. The first thing that hits you in that instant is the size and how wrong it is to see a mass like that in a lane meant for pickup trucks. It was covered in dark hair that hung in clumps when the moon hit it and looked almost black. The hair was not neatly groomed or shiny like an animal at the zoo. It was coarse and clumped, as if it had been wet or dragged through brush. The shoulders were broad, like a man carrying something heavy, but the whole thing carried that weight differently, like a weight that doesn't look like bone underneath. The face is the part that I can't shake. It was wrong for so many reasons. The skin on the face was exposed, hairless and leathery in the way an old glove looks after too much sun. It had the kind of lines and creases that make you think of weathered animals or someone who's lived outdoors for a long time. The eyes were huge and dark, and they looked at us like they had just been caught doing something private. They weren't shiny in a reflective animal way. They were flat and black and reading us. The mouth hung open a little, like someone who had been surprised into a snarl but choked before the sound came out. There wasn't any noise, I remember that. There was no growl, no hiss, nothing. It looked shocked and maybe annoyed, and that expression is what's stuck in my head. We all screamed at once. It wasn't a cinematic scream. It was the raw animal-human sound of being suddenly confronted with something that should not be there. I felt my chest tighten and my hands go to the sides of the seat like I could hold myself down. The driver didn't stall or fumble. He slammed his foot down. The engine roared and the tires bit into the gravel, and the car lurched forward with a jerk that threw our stomachs into our mouths. I remember the sound of gravel spitting out behind us and the car lights cutting an immediate tunnel through the dark. Even as I moved, I stayed glued to the glass, eyes fixed on that shape as if my whole life depended on watching it move. We saw it move in a way that didn't make sense. It didn't run like a person might when startled. It didn't lunge either. It moved with a bearing like it had the mass of a big animal, but the upright gait of a man. It scuttled around the curve, keeping pace with the edge of the road, so that even as we fled, I could follow it in my peripheral sight. The ditch there curves gently, and there were cottonwoods and tall grass beyond. It went around that bend without a heavy sound. The strangest thing was the silence. Our screams and the car filled the night, but the thing's movement made no added noise beyond the soft slap of damp hair against dirt, nothing like a heavy beast crashing. I kept watching it as the distance closed and then widened, the way you keep looking at a train you're riding away from. It looked back once as it moved, and that look felt small and terrible. The eyes were surprised like ours had been. It wasn't an expression that meant, "I will hurt you," or "I'm hunting you." It was an expression that suggested we had seen something that it had never expected to share air with. The mouth was still a little open, not making the sound we all thought it would, and that absence of sound made the whole moment louder. There was this thick, dense feeling in my chest, as if the world had been recentered and everything else was trivial. We kept going. Nobody slowed. The driver kept his foot down like someone trying to put flat distance between human beings and the unimaginable. We took the next curve, hoping to see a house or a farmhouse with lights on, something that signaled normal life. But all that waited was more dark and the moon sliding over fields. I couldn't get the image out of my head. The hair clumped at the shoulders, the leathery face, those eyes. Even after the car doors slammed and we were parked at the first place that felt safe, we sat there breathing and shaking. The radio blared some stupid song, and it felt like a betrayal for normal noise to return so quickly. There was talk, because what else do kids do when something like that happens? Someone joked up the old werewolf thing. Another said it was probably a guy in a costume. that someone had to be filming. A voice suggested we had been messed with by older kids. People started naming explanations, little offerings to a world that was trying to shove this moment back into the category of explainable. But none of those explanations fit what we had seen in that beam of light. A person in a costume wouldn't have that kind of face. The skin was real. The creases were the wrong kind for a mask. A person in a suit would have left prints or broken brush or made some noise leaving the ditch. We hadn't seen any of that. The mass and the movement of it didn't read like someone pretending. I tried to think practically even in that haze. If it was a human or a prank, why had it chosen to come up at the place where the road cut by the ditch? There were no houses nearby, no porch lights, no trucks parked in fields. The ditch there was a place for irrigation and moving animals, not for hanging out. And if it was a costumed prank, someone had done weeks of work to make their suit look like a body and then chosen a ditch and a moonlit night to pop up and scare passing kids. That theory wants to hold because it's sensible. But the face, the eyes, the way the thing moved, nothing about it was sensible. None of us could call back and tell the story cleanly. The words kept tumbling and collapsing into incredulity. We drove off that night and went home in a kind of stunned silence. People said different things, trying to stitch the scene back together into something normal. I remember the way the steering wheel felt hot where the driver's hands had held it, and the smell of the ditch clung to the air in the car, damp and green and strange. We parked, and nobody wanted to get out at first. You'd think adrenaline would make you want to run in circles and talk in loud bursts, but the opposite was true. The adrenaline hollowed us out. It felt like the world had been rearranged, so we were all living in a half-built room with tools scattered around, and none of us knew which thing to pick up. The thing I keep coming back to, even now, is how ordinary the rest of the night looked. The moon didn't blink. The ditch looked like any other ditch if you glanced at it after speed blurred your vision. The road curved the same way it always does. There was no sign of a struggle, no tuft of hair stuck on a fence post, no discarded mask, nothing that you could take into town and hand to someone who might write it down. That lack of evidence is what makes this stick in my head in the worst way. If there had been some physical proof, I could have shown someone, maybe a sheriff or an older neighbor who'd seen strange things. I could have rationalized it, or at least sat back and let someone else deal with the weirdness. But there was nothing, only the memory of a face in a ditch and 6 kids who had their lives altered growing up. I don't tell the story to chase attention. I tell it because I need to put the picture somewhere outside myself. People who weren't there will ask why we didn't stop and take a picture, or why we didn't do anything else. It's easy to ask that when you weren't frozen, when your hands weren't bearing down on the dash, and your heart had not turned into a matchstick ready to snap. In the moment, logic steps aside, and a primitive alarm takes over. You do the one thing your body can do fastest, put distance between you and the threat. The idea of stepping toward it to prove anything was not on the table. Now, when I drive out those roads, I look at that stretch and expect nothing. Most nights there's nothing. A ditch, some moonlight, the same curve. And that maybe is worse, because the memory doesn't get soothed by being repeated in daylight. It comes back bright and fierce, the light of the headlights sliding up the slopes of the ditch, the figure rising, those eyes, and that silence where the sound should have been. It's a single sequence that plays in my head sometimes when the house is quiet. I can see it as if I'm back in the glass, the face surprised, the mouth half open and not making noise, the hair dark and clumped. The final thing that sits with me from that night is how it simply ended. 1 second the beam found it, and the next second we were screaming and the car was gone. We looked back as much as we dared and watched it move around the curve and disappear into the darker tree line. There was no chase, no attack, no sudden second figure charging after us. It didn't follow, it didn't leap. It pivoted and it walked or moved, and then it was gone. We left with the engine a roar in our ears and the road unspooling ahead. We could not explain why it had come up out of the ditch at that moment, or why it had acted the way it did, and we had no proof to take to grown-ups who might declare it nonsense or something explainable. To this day, I can't explain what we saw. I can only tell you the clearest pieces: the full moon, the ditch smell, the sudden flare of headlights, the shape moving up out of the water, that face with the leathery skin and the hairless look, the wide, surprised eyes, the mouth like a stifled snarl, the scream we all made, the driver slamming the gas and the car leaping forward, and the way the figure disappeared around the curve with the night folding over it like nothing had happened. It stopped the moment it started, without a finale, without evidence, leaving a single frame burned into my memory. I have been trying to explain it ever since, and I still don't have an answer. Story 8. I still see those red dots when my eyes start to wander at night. It's been eating at me since that night on Red Creek Road, and the only way I can make any sense of it is by spelling it out the way it happened, step by step. Because every time I try to tell it out loud, it comes out messy, and people look at me like I'm making up fireworks. We were out in the arroyo because that's what we did sometimes. A short hike into the canyon, an evening away from town. The kind of place you go when you want to be where the radio and the streetlights don't reach. I had an old air rifle with me. Not a military piece, just a small pump-action one we carried for rabbits, and the stupid confidence it gives sitting by your side. My friend carried a pack and a headlamp zipped into it. Neither of us expected trouble. We started when the light was falling, planning to be back before it got too dark, and we parked the truck at the usual pullout off the gravel road. The arroyo there on Red Creek Road is a cut of hard earth with little benches and a few cottonwoods. When the sun goes, the place closes in fast. Sound gets flattened and shadows deepen into walls. We were probably a half-mile down into the wash when the day turned into a black that felt heavy instead of empty. The last of the light left the rim, and the world went two-dimensional, like someone turned off a stack of lamps and left a single match burning. We were moving slow, kicking small rocks, talking in the way people do when they're trying to push their nerves down, pointless jokes, dragging feet, nothing real. Then, out of the dark on the far side of the arroyo, two red lights fixed on us. Not a pair of reflections, not a flicker, They were two steady pinpricks of red, like the tail light on a truck stuck in a hollow, and they didn't move. They weren't at eye-level reflexes. They sat lower, deep in shadow, but they were bright and deliberate. I've seen animal eyes reflect light in the canyon, deer, foxes, the occasional owl, but those eyes didn't glow like that. They were flat and red, not the green-gold iris you expect. They were like somebody had taken embers and set them in a face. The air tightened. I remember my mouth going dry, like I'd swallowed every dollar of confidence I thought I had. My friend stopped walking, and the two of us just stood there, feeling like something had pressed its palm into our backs and said, "Don't move." The first thing that happened was stupid and reflexive. I raised the air rifle and fired. People ask me why I shot, and I still don't know. We weren't under attack, not at first. It was the kind of impulse that lands when fear and muscle replace thought. The rifle made a small pop, nothing like a centerfire rifle's crack, more like a loud can of air. I remember the pellet leaving the barrel and the smell of the metal on my hands. The shot was almost ceremonial, a small, sharp noise in a canyon that had been holding its breath. What happened after the shot is what won't let me sleep. The moment that pellet went off, something hit us. It wasn't just a shove or a ricochet. The ground felt like it flipped under my feet, like someone had taken the world and just shoved the edge of it away. I was thrown as if a giant hand had grabbed my collar and yanked. My legs went out, and I felt my back hit gravel and sand. Stone and dust tore at my palms and knees. I tasted copper and sand, and it took a second before I could make out that my skin had been opened. Little lines along my hands and arm, where grit had ground through the skin. My friend didn't move in the way you expect. He was knocked down hard enough that he didn't yell. He just lay there, stunned, face down in the dust for a long breath. And when he rolled over, his eyes went blank for a second, like someone had blinked him out. There was a fence post, an old one, splintered and rotten looking, that was half buried in the arroyo bank. I remember seeing it stick up, and then, in a way that still makes no physical sense to me, it came loose and flew across maybe 6 or 8 feet and hit him in the shoulder. It struck him like something heavy, and he went limp with a soundless spasm that made hot panic climb my throat. I don't know if the post was attached to a barbed wire that snapped, or if the upheaval of the ground launched it. All I know is 1 second my friend was on his feet, and the next second he was down and dazed, and the post was a few feet away, half split, and with a chunk of bark that had been a bark a second before. I crawled to him, and his cheek was pale and his breathing shallow. The dust stung both our eyes. We spat and tried to wipe grit from cuts. There was a taste like iron in my mouth, and my hands were raw where stones had grazed them open. I remember the small, frantic logic that sets in after something like that. Keys, 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 keys. I scrambled back to where we'd dropped our packs toward the truck, crawling on my hands now because running made the world flip under me. My pocket was empty. The truck key, the key fob, the little ring with the bank card, gone. I checked the ground, the brush, the folded canvas bag. Nothing. It was like they had been in my hand 1 second and the next nothing was there. My friend was only halfway conscious and trying to tell me something that sounded like words and ended up as a dry whisper. We managed to haul the gear and drag my friend to the truck and pile into the cab. The whole time we kept glancing back into the arroyo because the red points were still there at the far bank, steady as a heartbeat. We tried to start the truck and the engine turned over, but we had no keys to the ignition. My hands were shaking so hard I almost smashed the window with the door. We sat there with the engine dying and the red lights blurred into 2 dots that held the shadows like a stain. I wish I could say we had a plan after that. The truth is, we did something stupid and human. We tried to get away by heading west, deeper into the canyon. It felt like moving away from whatever it was to the side, where there were fewer trees and more open road. We climbed out and tried to head around the bend to the west to find cell signal and maybe find a neighbor or another truck to borrow a ride. The moment we pushed off the bank toward that bend, something was already waiting. It didn't look like an animal or a person. It looked like a haystack of dead grass and tumbleweeds piled into a mound low to the ground, and the 2 red eyes were set in its front like holes punched through burlap. It drifted into the road. Not with legs, not with a wobble like a rolling thing, but in a slow, deliberate way that made your skin crawl. It stopped squarely in front of the path. We thought about going around, and then realized there was brush on both sides. There was nowhere to go but forward, and the thing slid to block us as if it knew every inch we could use. We backed off and tried again an hour later, which sounds ridiculous now, but adrenaline scrambles time and confidence, and each time we made a move toward the west, something identical would cut us off. Not the same pile exactly, but the same idea. A rounded, low body of brush with those 2 steady red points. It never came at us. It didn't lunge or grab, it just blocked the way, patient and quiet. Each time we backed up, my stomach did another one of those drops where you taste bile. We kept trying because the truck had no keys and because you think you can outsmart anything if you just try hard enough. Every time the thing turned its lights at us and we felt our courage drained a little more. There's this small piece of me that keeps replaying the order in which things happened. The air rifle, the shot, the shove, the fence post, the missing keys, the first haystack, the second, the panic building like a bad tide. It's like watching a bad film on a loop. We tried to go past it at least 3 times, easing the truck forward, easing back, trying to find a hole in the canyon wall that would let us slip by. Every time we were blocked. It didn't touch the truck, it didn't need to. The blocking was enough. It filled the road and made the idea of west impossible. At some point, we simply changed the plan and went east. We used the other direction because it seemed less hemmed in, like maybe it led to a county road or a place where someone would see us. We drove east slowly and kept glancing in the rear view, seeing shapes like the ones that had cut us off at every bend. After a while, we hit a paved road, and someone in a pickup finally stopped after seeing the state we were in. He looked at our clothes, at the streaks of blood on my hands, at the dust in our hair, and gave us a ride to the next service station. When we finally got into the light and out of the canyon and into a place with people and coffee, we sat and tried to put it together. My friend's shoulder was swollen where that post had hit him, and he kept rubbing at the place like he could massage sense back into it. We explained bits of it in clipped sentences to the guy in the shop who was bandaging friends and helped us call someone. He listened, and then he did something I didn't expect. He shook his head slow and called it by a name I'd never heard, Wizooey Man, like he was naming an old bruise. He told us, quickly and like it was not worth much, that people in the canyon talked about a presence that comes up in the arroyo, something that lurks in piles of brush and watches. He didn't look like he was teaching us a lesson or making a joke. He just sounded like someone reciting a thing that gets said at a table 100 times. Whatever it was, the fact someone had a name for the feeling made it 10 times worse. Names mean other people have seen it too, and that doesn't comfort you so much as it proves you're not the only one whose courage was burned clean away. We didn't go back. We had scratches, and we had a man with a swollen shoulder who could barely lift his arm. We had no keys, which still makes me furious when I think about it. Something had taken them, or they had been knocked away and lost to whatever shook that arroyo. The sheriff drove out the next morning with a couple of deputies because they wanted to check if we'd been hit by a falling limb or run into some strange weather event. They found the fence post half buried where we said it had been, and the cracked earth where the ground had been tossed, but they also had questions. They didn't call it Wizooey Man. They called it weird and made notes, and then life moved on. People in town told us their own versions in low voices by the pump about shapes in the dark and eyes like coals. None of those stories changed the central truth to me. The red points stared at us, and then everything else happened. I don't go back down Red Creek Road at night anymore. I still carry the small itch of being watched when I pass canyons on the highway. The more I try to explain it with sensible words, the more the story sloughs off those words and leaves me with a handful of violent images. The pellet pop, the shove into gravel, the fence post that struck like a thrown spear, the missing keys, the haystack that moved like a wall and never touched us, the 2 red dots like char marks that burned into the memory of my eyes. They took my small, ordinary courage, the kind you used to stroll around in the dark and laugh at shadows, and whatever took it didn't need to touch me to do it. People say a lot of things to make sense of a night like that. They talk about stress, about illusions, about tricks of light. Maybe some of it fits. I can't prove anything, and that sits like a stone in my chest. All I know is what happened in that arroyo. I know the way the dust felt against new cuts on my hands. I know the way my friend pressed at his shoulder and couldn't get the shape of the impact out of his head. I know how the keys were there a second and gone the next. I know how the red points held the dark like a promise, and how every attempt to go west ran into the same unmoving, moving barrier. And the worst part is how suddenly it stopped. 1 minute there were eyes, and the next I had bruises and a missing key and a truck I couldn't start, and we were making a decision to go east because that was the only open door. I have no tidy finish to the night, no decisive climax, no final image of a creature collapsing or fleeing. It just stopped. The lights went out in the arroyo the way a candle goes out if you nudge it, and I was left with the aftertaste of fear and the smell of dust and the way my hands kept trembling for a long time after. The red dots burned whatever it was out of me. They took the easy, dumb bravery you have at the edge of dark and left only a quiet, careful person who checks pockets and avoids canyons after sunset. I don't have a good ending. I only have the memory and the knowledge that there was something there, blocking the way west in a body of brush with 2 red points where eyes should be, that could make a fence post leave the ground and strike a man, that could take my keys and leave nothing but confusion. And then it stopped. I still can't explain it. Story 9. I still think about that afternoon between Indian Hills and Kittredge like it happened 5 minutes ago. We were out poking around the creek because that's what we did. Nothing fancy, just the 3 of us and my dog, looking for cool places to jump from the rocks and toss sticks. It was one of those clear late summer days in Jefferson County where the sun is warm but the shade under the trees is actually cool, and the creek runs clear over flat stones. I'd been going to that stretch since I was a kid. I knew where you could step without twisting an ankle, where the willow roots made a half-decent seat, and where the water dug a little deeper in a bend so you could wade without getting too cold. I tied the leash to my wrist because the dog had a habit of bolting. He's a big, energetic dog, long-legged and stubborn. Tying the leash makes it so you don't drop the line when he takes off. It's a dumb habit I picked up because a couple of times he'd taken off after a raccoon and I'd ended up chasing him. That day, I had the leash looped twice around my wrist, the clip to his collar tight, my other hand carrying a water bottle and my phone. We weren't far in. The creek was a 20-minute walk from the gravel pullout off Wadsworth, or the old road that runs between Indian Hills and Kittredge. The smell of wet stone and pine was under everything, the kind of smell that keeps you quiet without thinking. He saw something, and the leash went taut, like a snapped wire. 1 second, he was at my side, and the next he lunged forward. The momentum yanked my arm, and the leash dug into my skin. I remember the noise of him tearing through the undergrowth, a wet rushing, leaves cracking, the small panic bark he does when he finds something exciting. The leash tightened further until I was being dragged toward the creek edge. My foot caught on a hidden root, and I slammed into a tangle of willow and cedar brush. The leash wrapped around a branch and around my wrist, and for a second I just lay there with twigs in my hair, mouth full of dust, my heart jackhammering because the world had flipped from lazy to sudden. I managed to get my right hand free from the tangle and peel the loop off my wrist. That's when I noticed how quiet everything had become. It wasn't the normal creek quiet. It was a pulled-in quiet, like the day held its breath. My dog was still on the other end of the leash, front paws planted, his whole body pointing down into the stream bed like he'd found a rabbit or a beaver. He was tense in that ridiculous way dogs get when they don't want to let go of something. I slid forward on my knees and clawed at the brush until I could get a view through the willows, and there it was, standing in the stream bed maybe 20 feet away. I want to be honest about this because I still don't know how else to put it. My brain stalled. It didn't process the face or the details in the way you expect. What came first was the size and the posture. It was immense. The height made the willow trunks look small beside it. It stood upright, not hunched like a bear, not on all fours. Its shoulders were broad and square. The fur was light brown, soaked and hanging in clumps, water running off it in strings that hit the stones and made tiny splashes. It looked wet and darkened where the water clung to the hair. For a second I thought maybe it was some stunt, a guy in a suit, something someone had dragged out of a van to scare people. But in the same instant my body told me that made no sense. The mass of it moved with a quiet that wasn't natural. No panting, no wet ruffle of a dog, nothing. I tried to look for a face, like you reach for something you dropped. But the memory of the face is a hole now. I can't pull an image of its eyes or nose or mouth from that moment. It's all a blank where those details should be. When I try to remember the face, I get a cold, flat nothing, a terror-shaped void that sits in the place of image. What survives are the outer things, the way the shoulders made a silhouette against the sky, the wet hair clinging to long arms, and the slow, effortless way it straightened. I remember thinking, with the stupid clarity you get when your body is in survival mode, that is not a human. And right after thinking that I could feel the world narrow down to the scrape of my knuckles on bark and the desperate little shirt pocket breath of my dog, I tore back toward my brothers without thinking. I was yelling, not a scripted, coherent thing, just a raw shout, for them to climb the nearest tree. I'm ashamed to admit I didn't stay calm. There was no plan. One of them threw his hands up and scrambled, grabbing at low limbs, nails finding bark. The other already had his boots catching, and he was up the trunk before I could tell him to move faster. They climbed maybe 10, 12 feet into a spruce that had enough side branches to sit on. I remember the scrape of pine sap on my palms as I helped pull them up, the bark rough under my fingers. My dog, meanwhile, had frozen mid-step at the creek's edge, a low whine folding out of his throat. We sat up there shaking and watching, the three of us and the dog down in the scrub, and waited. The hours compressed. The creek's sound returned in a thin way, the little slap of water around stones, but every tiny noise thereafter had weight. A pebble shifting sounded like a bouquet of gravel tumbled. Every small drip from leaf to leaf registered like a footfall. I couldn't hear my brother's breathing without it sounding loud and panicky. We crouched on that branch, knees bouncing, the cold of sap on my skin, and the animal, whatever it was, just stood there. It didn't shout or stomp. It didn't move toward us, which is the thing that makes me keep second-guessing, because if it wanted to be aggressive, it could have covered the ground easily. It didn't reach for a tree or lift a long arm. It simply occupied the stream bed and watched. Time has this strange quality when your brain checks out. I don't know if we were up there 5 minutes or 20. My watch would have told me one thing, but my chest told me another. When you're held in that kind of fear, minutes expand into something else. My younger brother kept whispering the stupid things you whisper in a crisis. Stuff like, what if we climb down? And should we shout? But no one wanted to make the first sound. Not because we were brave, but because we all felt that same heavy, stupid certainty that making noise would do the wrong thing. My hands cramped around the branch, and my palms were open and raw from gripping the trunk. At one point, I thought I saw a movement at the edge of my vision, like a wash of water or a small animal darting, and my whole body wanted to jerk my brothers down and run. Instead, I bit at the inside of my cheek until it tasted like metal. The dog made a low whine and buried his nose in the dirt, like old fear made him small. The figure stayed where it was, water dripping from hair, dripping onto stone and making tiny circles. It might have shifted its weight, nothing dramatic, just a minor reposition, and somehow that told me it was still thinking. We waited for something to break the silence. We expected a sound because the world has rules where large animals make large sounds. We expected a twig to snap, a shout of a human, a crash of something falling. Nothing came, not a twig, not a stomp, not a call. The creek kept running, a thin, ordinary noise, and the figure remained like a silhouette carved into the bank. The feeling of being watched stuck to my skin the way sweat does. It was physical and impossible to shake in that moment. I could feel it in my scalp, behind my eyes, like someone's breath resting on the back of my neck. When we finally eased down, because you can't stay forever in a tree, and my legs had gone rubbery, I remember how small the world felt under my feet again. My knees refused to take my weight properly at first. My breathing was fast and shallow, like I'd been sprinting. We backed away from the creek in a slow, guarded way, keeping our eyes on the water. The dog stayed close, tail tucked, refusing to go down. I called him softly, and he came, but with reluctance that made him shiver. We didn't go straight to the truck. We walked the long way back across the trail, shoulders hunched and ears straining, as if the thing might materialize behind a stump or appear on the path like a bad mirage. On the walk back, every small sound from the creek turned my head like a real person turning toward a distant shout. A stone, dropping in the water sounded to me like a heavy footfall. A bird taking off made my heart jump. My hands were numb, my mouth dry, and my throat felt tight in a way that lasted the rest of the day. By the time we reached the parking area, we were a mess of adrenaline and dust. The truck seats smelled like leather and sweat, and my brother's sticky cola. We sat there in silence, nobody wanting to put words to what had happened, because words make it real in a different way, and because none of the words seemed to fit. They asked what I had seen. I tried to say things that sounded credible. It was huge. It was upright. It had light brown fur and it was wet. But they pressed for a face, and I had to tell them the truth, that I couldn't remember it. That part is humiliating. People want a detail to hang on, and I offered them a blank. They looked at me like I'd left a page of a story out. I couldn't explain that the image of the face had been replaced by a kind of feeling, a hole where details should be. It's not like forgetting the color of a shirt. It's like someone took that part of the picture away on purpose. We didn't go back that day. We drove away and tried to be normal. But the normal things had cracks in them after that. The sound of a creak on the highway made my muscles clench. The dogs at the service station seemed too loud. I unclipped and clipped the leash a dozen times, checking the loop on my wrist like some small compulsion to make sure nothing like that could catch us off guard again. Even hours later, in the shower at home with the water hitting my shoulders, I could feel the same prick along the back of my neck. My legs were rubbery for the rest of the night, and I slept badly, waking to the sense of being watched into the small hours. I don't have a tidy ending for this, because there wasn't one. We sat in trees waiting for some sound to explain it, and nothing explained it. It didn't charge us, didn't call out, didn't leave tracks that we could find in the mud easily enough to photograph. There was no hair clinging to a branch to pull down and check, nothing that would give the story to someone else and let them do the heavy lifting of making sense of it. The creek stayed the same bend, the same stones, while something huge and upright stood in it and watched. Then we came down and left, and the place was still there like any creek, water moving around rocks, birds calling. People will ask why I didn't go back with a camera, why I didn't try to follow it, why there is no evidence. The answer is the part of me that hates admitting how primitive we still are. Fear makes you do small, stupid things. It made us climb trees instead of take pictures. It made us leave without touching the creek bed to look for prints. It made us choose distance and the safe certainty of a gravel parking lot over answers. I keep thinking about making a trip back the way you think on a Band-Aid. I know there's a scar there, and maybe if I peel it off carefully, I'll see something reasonable underneath. But part of me flinches when I imagine stepping into that bend again. The last memory I have is of the figure standing in the stream, dripping, the wet hair sliding off long arms, the shape of it cutting a straight line through the light, and the blank where the face should have been. Then there was the scramble and the climb and the strange small sounds that filled the creek after we sat 20 feet up in a spruce, and finally the silence that didn't get broken by a twig or a voice. Only the regular shallow noise of the creek, and the three of us up a tree, shaking. It stopped without scene. For me, that's the worst part. Not being able to explain it, not finding something to lay on a table and say, here, test this. I have the memory and the feeling stuck to my skin and the hole where the face should be. Even now, every time I hear running water, my hands want to tighten on a branch and my legs go soft, because the watching never really left me the way the creek did. Story 10. I keep turning the night over in my head because nothing about it sits right. My foster son works for the Forest Service, and he'd been grumbling for weeks about the signs around Turquoise Lake. Sturdy official signs, the ones that are bolted to posts and meant to last, kept showing up ripped off and tossed aside like toys. They'd started greasing the tops so people couldn't climb them or hang things from them, the way crews do sometimes, and that worked for a while. Then one afternoon, Not long before that night, we drove by and found a sign pulled free and lying face down in the dirt. The grease at the top was smudged, and there was an impression in it, the outline of a very large hand, palm, and long fingers pressed through the slick. It looked like someone had used a glove and then wiped it off, but it wasn't a glove. It was too human, wide palm, thick fingers, and it left a slick print the size of something heavier than a normal man's hand. That was the little background that stuck with me all day. We weren't planning anything dramatic that night. It was one of those spur-of-the-moment decisions. I'd been wanting to get out of the house, and he wanted to show me a few stretches of trail he checks for work. We ended up driving down the service road, past the turnoff for Turquoise Lake, and parked maybe 2 kilometers below the lake, where a narrow creek runs near the road. It was late, the kind of night where the air is thin and the kind of cold that makes your lungs sting a little. We had a handheld spotlight in the truck and a small flashlight clipped to the dash. I remember the truck doors creaking when we shut them, the hush of the pine line and the smell of sage and damp earth. We walked along the road first, mostly to stretch our legs and talk about nothing in particular. The creek was a low ribbon of black water under the road, and it makes a constant small noise that blends into the rest of the night. After a while we stood still near a bend where a little tributary comes down and feeds into the creek. My foster son had his headlamp on low, and I had the spotlight aimed at the bank for no real reason, habit more than anything. We both knew there was nobody else around. That's the kind of place you go to if you want to be alone. Then we heard something. First it was a soft sloshing, like someone stepping through shallow water, each foot making a little wet sound as it moved. It was steady and deliberate, not the sporadic splash of an animal taking off. My first thought was a fisherman, someone trying their luck in the dark. My second thought was to aim the spotlight. I swept the beam along the creek and onto the stones. For a beat there was nothing in the light. The sloshing stopped. It cut off so clean that my chest went cold for a second. We kept the light on, scanning the creek, and the silence held. That's when the ridiculous part of me wanted proof so badly I could taste it. I turned the beam away and then back again, slow like someone checking if a branch had moved. That's when my foster son stepped back and said quietly, "Cut it." He nodded toward the beam, the way you point at a snake. I shut off the spotlight. The moment the light went out, the sloshing started up again, as if someone had been frozen, until I turned the light away. That's the only way I can describe it. It returned in the dark and closer. It sounded like a pair of heavy feet moving through water, slow and careful, not running, just moving. The feeling that came with it was something I've never felt so clearly. As if whatever was making that sound didn't want to be seen. It wasn't a human caution. It felt different. Practice like not being noticed was part of its nature. We stood there and waited. My hands were cold, but not from the air. They shook a little from adrenaline, the way they do when you realize you've been careless. We didn't call out. We didn't turn the light back on right away, because the idea of lighting up a figure that hated being seen felt insane, like a trap. My foster son moved a fraction, lowering his headlamp until it was a thin coin of light on the ground. We watched the blackness along the creek, the sound of water pattering, and then a movement caught the corner of my eye, and a silhouette crossed the road beyond our headlights. It wasn't close. It was over by the sage, past the shine of the truck lights, and it didn't run. It crossed the road in a single fluid motion and slipped into the low sagebrush on the far side. For a second I thought it was a deer or some person who'd been fishing, but then I saw the way it carried itself. It was upright, walking on 2 legs, and the shoulders were broad. It made no extra noise as it moved. The grass flattened under it like the air was being pushed aside. It vanished into the sage in the span of maybe 2 seconds, not the slow disappearing you get when something moves behind a tree, but a quick, quiet slide between shadows. I hit the spotlight back on reflex and swept the beam to where it had gone. In the stark white glare, The road looked empty, normal, littered with the same tufts of sage and small scattered stones we'd been seeing all night. But then out past the sage, where the ground drops into a stand of trees, I saw a trail of flattened vegetation cutting into the edge of the bosque. It wasn't a path someone would make, walking normally. It was a line of squashed sage and bent stems, a clear direction heading into the trees. The metal clink of the spotlight felt loud against the hush. We followed the flattened trail for maybe a dozen paces, my heart thudding like a fist. The air smelled stronger where the sage had been bent, that sharp, bitter scent, and I could tell the ground had been pressed down recently. Then I swept the spotlight further along the tree line and caught something else, a motion in the branches. And for a moment, my breath stopped. It passed in front of a boulder, a huge rock that towers above the scrub, at least 4 meters and 50 centimeters in height. The way it moved in front of that boulder is burned into me because nothing about it fit the usual catalogue of animals. It didn't duck. It didn't look like it needed cover. It simply walked upright across the thin open and passed in front of that rock like it was the shortest step in the world for it. The silhouette was full and human-shaped, shoulders, torso, long arms, but the scale was wrong. It looked large next to the boulder, close enough that the top of its head might have reached a significant portion of the rock's height. Then it was gone into the trees beyond the boulder, swallowed without rustle. The thing that hit me after that was the silence. The creek rolled on, the night breathed, but the noise that had occupied every part of me, the sloshing that had been so alive a moment before, stopped in a way that left a hollow. The silence felt heavy, like someone had set a lid on the air and tightened it. I felt my chest pinch and found myself breathing shallow, not from physical exertion, but from the refusal of the world to answer the question I was asking. There was no second movement, no snap of a branch to tell me where it went, nothing to point to and say, "There, look, we could have chased it." That thought was stupid and instant in my head. We were close enough to run if we had wanted to, and we both had flashlights and keys and the light of the truck a few meters away. But neither of us moved toward the trees. There was a weird logic that took over. The kind you don't plan, the kind that says, don't go after whatever you don't fully understand. My foster son, who sees things like this for work, stood rigid and then turned and put a hand on my shoulder. He's a practical man, and the look on his face said everything without words. We backed away quietly toward the truck instead, keeping our eyes on the dark, where that form had gone. Everything that followed was small and mundane and felt ridiculous at the time. Sliding into the cab, the keys in the ignition, the crunch of gravel as we pulled away. Under those ordinary motions, my heart wouldn't settle. I kept glancing in the rear view, but the trees were just trees, and the sage was just sage. We drove a little farther down the road, circling in a slow way because we were both thinking about the thing that had walked in front of that 4 meters and 50 centimeters boulder. We passed the place again, and there was no mark left in the air, no glow, no rustle, just the road and a scatter of rocks. I've tried to make rational explanations in the hours since, and I keep hitting the same wall. Maybe it was a person, maybe a hunter or someone odd using a disguise. But the scale was wrong, and the way the creature reacted when the light hit, frozen, then gone as soon as the light disappeared, did not feel like a human behavior. It was deliberate avoidance. Maybe it was a bear standing up with a human shape. I've seen bears stand to look. But the silhouette was too straight and the shoulders were too square. The sign grease with a handprint that we'd seen earlier that day circled back in my mind and made the hair on my arms prick with an old, quiet dread. That's the thing that keeps me up, the small chain of evidence and the sudden stop. A ripped sign with grease and a big hand impression. The sloshing of steps in the creek that only happened when we turned off the light. A silhouette crossing a road and vanishing into sage. A trail of flattened vegetation leading into the trees. The upright form moving in front of a boulder 4 meters and 50 centimeters high and then disappearing. None of those details alone prove anything, but together they make a picture that refuses to sit in any normal box. I have nothing to put on a table and say, "Test this." I have notes and a story, and the exact memory of my foster son's hand on my shoulder, steady and white-knuckled. After we left that night, the silence followed me. Not the kind of silence that's peaceful, but the kind that presses into your chest and refuses to loosen. I kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see something in the dark sway of trees that would explain it, but there was nothing. The next morning, it felt worse because the day made the night real in an ordinary way. The sun came up, people went about their jobs, and the world demanded normal answers. I could not find one. I'm not trying to sell anything or to turn this into a grand story. I'm saying what happened in the simplest way I can. There was a sign torn off and greased that same day with a large human-like hand impression. We went out that night, about 2 kilometers below Turquoise Lake. We heard footsteps sloshing in the creek. When we turned off our light, the sound returned. A silhouette crossed the road beyond our headlights and vanished into the sage. We found a trail of flattened vegetation into the trees. When I swept the spotlight, I watched an upright form pass in front of a boulder, 4 meters and 50 centimeters tall, and disappear into the dark. And then the silence came down so heavy on my chest I could barely breathe. It stopped without an explanation. That's the last thing I remember clearly. The exact way the night shut down after it left. There's no tidy ending where we chase it out and pin it down. There's only the plain fact of what we saw and what happened next. It ended abruptly, and I have been unable to explain it since. Oh, Story 11. I still remember the way the screen bowed under the weight of something that should not have fit in the world outside my mother's little house. That night sits in my head like a tight, jagged memory I keep revisiting because I still haven't solved it. I grew up north of Montrose, out on Old Airport Road, a place that feels quiet most of the time, with the old runway a flat grey line you can see from the porch, and not much traffic after dark. My mother's house was small, 1-story, porch light that always buzzed when the wind picked up. The front door has that narrow window next to it, the kind you can press your face against from the inside and see straight out into the yard. That window and the screen in front of it are the center of what happened. It started the way stupid, scary things usually do, not with certainty, but with a joke that went wrong. I was sitting in the living room late, stupidly watching a game, when my friend, Jeff, that's an alias he uses because he still worries about the way people hear things, ran in and said someone was at the front door. He sounded half serious and half wanting to prank me. At first I thought it was one of those drunk neighbors trying to be funny. I don't know why I walked up to the door instead of calling out or locking myself in a room. I guess part of me wanted to catch the prankster or at least see their face. When I stepped up to the window and peered, a face met mine at the height of the glass. Not a face in the way a neighbor's face looks when they joke. Something round and wrong was pressed near the pane. It filled that narrow rectangle so completely that I thought at first it was a stranger's head stuck to the glass. The head was rounded like a coconut, dim in the porch light, a shape without the usual definition of a nose and jaw I would expect. I could only see it for a heartbeat, not because it moved away right then, but because my body did what adrenaline tells you to do. I stepped back like someone had hit me. I ran, and I don't run easily. My heart was loud in my ears, and the floorboards creaked under my feet in a normal way that felt wrong because my body was rushing. Jeff and I did not talk. We both ran to my mother's bedroom, which is at the front of the house, thinking we'd get her to laugh or to call someone and make this ridiculous situation stop. Instead, when we were both inside the bedroom and the door was shut, we heard breathing outside. Not a wind sift or a distant engine, but a close, wet kind of inhalation that sounded like somebody standing right by the window, taking a slow breath. It set the hair up along my neck and made my fingers go cold even under the covers. Then the scratching started. It was thin at first, like nails or a stick being dragged across mesh, and it moved along the outside edge of the window. I remember the exact sound of it because it went on and on in my head after. A rasping noise that slid over the fabric of the screen and made a soft, scissor-like chatter against the frame. My friend whispered something, and there was no humor in it. We both knew it wasn't a prank now. We could have left the house, called the sheriff, dialed a friend. Instead, we froze in that tiny room because our body made us stay and listen. Then something pressed against the screen. Not a hit or a slap, but a full, solid push. The mesh bowed inward like a hand pushing foam, and for a moment the whole window seemed to flex toward the bedroom. I could see the hollows where fingers would press against a palm, the screen dimpling under the pressure. And when the space between the metal and the glass was brief, the outline of a hand lay flat against it. Big, too big, the way an adult's hand looks on a child's jacket. It didn't have fingernails like a man's soft hands. It had long, thick fingers, and the palm covered more of the window than any normal human palm ever could. We measured it without thinking, not with a measuring tape, but with the way people measure things when their brain tries to make sense of scale. The top of that window is found at about eye level if you're standing on the porch, and to press a hand that high and make it reach the screen as it did would mean whatever outside would have had to be immense. In my head, I ran numbers clumsily and settled with the impossible, about 3 meters tall to reach that height and press flat enough to bulge the screen the way it did. The thought that something that tall could stand at the porch and look in without making noise made my stomach drop. Then the sound right outside the room changed. It became a heavy inhalation and a slow scrape along the siding, as if something was shifting its weight. I could hear the screen creaking where the hand pushed, and that noise is the one that will not leave me. It's a metal-on-cloth sound seared in my memory, and it kept me from thinking anything but, this is real. We did the worst manageable thing. We grabbed the old .22 rifle that sat propped by the closet. We were not normals in those moments of fear. People don't stop and decide what's smart. They snap to the first tool they can reach. 2 shots, I remember thinking, because that's the number that popped into my head as if rehearsed. My hands were not steady. I should have known better than to take 2 rounds of .22 and point them at a window. But at that moment, it felt like the only choice. The rifle's butt bit into my shoulder, and I fired once. The sound was small and sharp, but it felt like an explosion to me. The pellet left with a soft cheep, and the room lost its air for a second. I braced for a noise, a cry, a crack of wood. Instead, there was the thinnest of whines, a sound that I can only describe now as a breath letting out. And then the thing bolted, not with a great leap, but with a sudden, swift movement away from the house, like someone slipping down from a porch in a single motion about the width of a step and gone into the dark. We fired the second time more out of automatic dread than aim. It was a stupid, scattered shot. We missed. The rifle recoiled, and the echo seemed small and silly in the open night. But the thing was gone. For the rest of that breathless minute, the yard was empty of movement. The porch light hummed, the old runway sat like a slab of velvet in the distance, and we stood panting in the bedroom with our hands shaking and our heads swimming. We called the sheriff because what else do you do when you point a gun at a window and something leaves? The deputy arrived fast, maybe in less than an hour, or so it feels in my memory. Time became a stretch thing that night. The sheriff took a careful look at the screen from the outside, the way someone checks a tool. He walked the yard, tapped at the porch, and then stepped up to the window where the hand had been. He ran his fingers along the mesh and felt right where we had felt the bowing. And then he looked at me and said something we all still remember. There were holes. He showed us where the screen had holes, small round breaks in the mesh, which at first I thought were from the gun. It was strange. The holes were not bleeding with anything, not slicked with blood or hair or anything a body might rub into the weave. There were no footprints in the soft dirt under the porch either, no deep prints where a weight might have stood for that long. The sheriff said he would write it up as odd, took pictures, and then made that practical move of asking how many times we'd seen it, whether we'd spoken to neighbors, whether there'd been any other disturbances. The sheriff's face was neutral, but dark around the eyes, like he'd seen too much to be surprised. After he left, we sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall, like the room might dissolve and reveal the answer. We kept replaying the moment the hand pressed, and how the screen had held that shape a fraction of breath longer than it should have. The hand mark, the holes, the silence, those pieces felt like a proof that didn't want to make sense. I should say here that I don't tell people this like it's a big hunting story or to scare anyone. It wasn't dramatic in the way a movie scene is dramatic. It was raw and small and too close to the house. We went out later that night because the fear had turned into some stupid, stubborn pride that needed to check whether it would happen again. We went down the drive and flicked the truck lights on. The asphalt of Old Airport Road looked empty, and for a second, I let myself think it was over. Then a silhouette stood in the middle of the road, big, broad, a dark thing shaped like a person but too high in the shoulders to be human. I can't tell you the exact second that my hands went to the gun again. I do remember the taste of metal in my mouth and the smell of cold diesel from the truck. My friend grabbed the barrel because we both felt our hands shaking. I raised the rifle and we actually fired again. But I know now that we fired in the opposite direction of the silhouette. I can't explain why. Terror fogs judgment. Maybe it was the blind panic that makes people run away and point guns at anything that isn't them. Maybe it was the sudden, idiotic idea that shooting into the air would help. Whatever reason we told ourselves later, it was the wrong one. The shots went off, echoed against the empty fields, and the thing shifted and left without turning a sound like a person fleeing. We drove off without stopping, terrified and ashamed and stupid for what we had done, and the road returned to normal, like someone had swept a hand across it. The thing that clings to me the most is the hand mark on the screen. Everyone remembers different parts: the silhouette, the sound, the shots. For me, the mark in the mesh is the proof that gets into the brain and files itself under things that make you cautious about the night. The sheriff's photo sits in my phone even now because I can't throw that image away. It shows the small round breaks, the dimples near the frame, and the way the screen looks like someone had tried to press a huge palm through it. There was no blood. There were no footprints. No other signs showed up, and the sheriff made the same face. The one that says he has seen odd things before and has to record them as formal notes, but cannot give you a comforting answer. After that night, my sleep changed. I started checking the front window from the inside before I closed my curtains. I kept a flashlight by the bed and meant to be rational about it, and then found myself hearing the scratch in every scrape of a tree limb. People said what you'd expect, that it was a prank, that maybe somebody had a mask, that we'd spooked ourselves into seeing a face. Some of that could be true. But a mask doesn't make the screen bow like a hand, and a mask doesn't leave the holes the sheriff photographed. Even if some explanation for the holes existed, it doesn't change the thing I felt that night. A presence close enough to press itself against the barrier between inside and out and watch us from the dark. Sometimes I replay the whole thing and try to find the point where I could have done something else. Should I have called my mother downstairs? Should I have taped the window and waited until dawn? The answers are not generous. All I can say in the clearest way I can is what actually happened that night. A face at the window, a scraping, a hand pressed hard enough to bend the screen, 2 shots fired by me that missed, and then the quiet. The sheriff checked and confirmed holes in the screen, and no tracks to explain how something so big had been there and left, without leaving the sort of evidence a living, breathing thing would normally. Later that night, or a little while after, We saw a giant shape standing on the road and fired in the opposite direction because we were panicked and stupid. The final image I keep is the shadow of that hand in the mesh and the sheriff's flashlight making the holes into black dots on his camera. That is the last clear thing in the night. Metal mesh with a palm's pressure in it, and the realization that something had been that close to my mother's face and mine and had slid away without explanation. It stopped. We had the 2 shots, the holes, and the silence that followed. I still can't explain why it came or what it wanted, and the hand mark on the screen is the thing that proves to me, and to no one else who wants a tidy answer, that something real was there and then just stopped, leaving a single ugly question of what we are to do when the night leans into your life and then walks away. Story 12. I still get that tight feeling in my chest when I picture the ridge. We started the day high up on the west side of Pikes Peak, the kind of climb that leaves your legs heavy and your breath shallow even when you're used to altitude. It was a clear day, the kind that makes you glad you got up early. My brother and my boss were with me. We were moving down the slope toward the small lakes tucked below the ridge because we figured it would be easier than going back up the way we came. It was supposed to be an easy descent, a quiet finish to a long morning of hiking. The ground up there is all rock and scrub, not like a forest where everything muffles. You can hear your own boots on the scree. The wind off the ridge cut a steady, sharp line across the air, and because we'd been climbing, we moved together in a tight line, hands on poles, heads down, listening to each other's breath. The sun was warm against the back of my neck, and the last snow patches clung to north-facing hollows. I remember when the field opened out into the small alpine meadow below, the kind of place that looks like it was left over from some older world. Low grass, scattered wildflowers, and a wide view that drops off to a couple of tarns in the bowl. It's the kind of place that makes you slow because it's pretty, and because you want to catch the view before the clouds move. We were heading over the last little shoulder when one of us stopped. At first I thought it was the altitude or one of those stupid jokes hikers make when they want to be dramatic. Then I looked where he was looking, and I saw 2 small dark specks parked in the meadow down below, lined up like 2 people watching the ridge. From where we were, the distance looked like a painting detail. Too far for a face, too small for anything but shapes. They were roughly half a mile away if you measure the drop with your eye, maybe a little less. I pulled out my binoculars because you do that reflexively at a place like that. You lift them without thinking and try to pin down what the shapes are. My binoculars are nothing fancy, but they do the job. I put them to my face, and the meadow filled the lenses. The 2 shapes were still there, aligned the way they had been with a gap between them. For a beat I thought they were just other hikers, people who found a good spot to look back up the ridge. Then the image in my glass changed. The 2 shapes melted into one. It wasn't some trick of light. The 2 people I'd seen at a glance collapsed into a single form, a dark, tall thing moving across the grass in a way my eyes refused to accept. It stood upright, not hunched or on all fours, and it was broader than any man I'd ever seen standing in daylight. The arms were long, almost too long, swinging in a smooth, almost liquid motion that covered ground in a stride I couldn't fit into the frame of what I knew about walking. It moved with a rhythm like a metronome, and every step seemed effortless, like it knew exactly where to put its feet, so the grass barely complained. I remember the stupid little details because when something shocks you, your brain grabs the weird facts first. The color looked like a deep, even black in the way a shadow is black when the sun is behind it. The shoulders were boxy and set like someone who carries weight regularly. There wasn't a pack, there wasn't gear, no hats, or the telltale flash of nylon. It was a single silhouette, and it was passing from one side of the meadow to the other in what I later clocked in my head as less than 15 seconds. It took maybe 3 or 4 long strides and then vanished into the dark line of trees at the meadow's edge. We all froze. There's a moment when your body is so full of adrenaline you go still because moving seems to require an extra command you don't have. My brother didn't say anything. My boss didn't either. We were literally 3 people on a slope, and there was a big thing walking across an open field. Nobody laughed, nobody joked. The world narrowed down to wind and the soft click of binocular lenses and the panicked beat of my own heart. I felt my hands go slick against the straps of my pack. I remember thinking a dozen different things at once. A prank, a hunter in a costume, some guy who'd wandered out of a movie set, and then discarding them because they didn't add up. There was no backpacks. No footprints were visible from our distance. No clue that someone had slogged across the field earlier. It wasn't moving like a person shuffling along clumsily. The stride was long and smooth. The arms swung with a loose power like each step covered 15-20 feet. I tried to count the seconds and failed because time had become a soft, stretched thing. My brother and I lowered our binoculars together and looked at my boss. He looked back at us and then over at the meadow like he was trying to be rational for our sakes. We debated for a heartbeat whether to backtrack and go down to where it had entered the trees. We didn't have a plan, and more honestly, we didn't have the nerve. We stood and watched the shadow of where it had been. For a long time, the only thing moving was a little ripple of sunlight over the grass. And then the trees swallowed that dark line, and the meadow looked empty, like nothing had crossed it at all. That's the thing that stayed with me. The raw, simple fact that something huge and upright walked across a field while we stood in the sun, and nobody did anything to stop it, because there was nothing to do. If it had been a bear, you'd expect some noise, a rustle, the way a bear scrambles. If it had been a person, you'd expect clothing, boots, gear, a voice. But this thing passed without a sound beyond the wind and the light brush of grass. There was an economy to its movement, like it repeated that path a lot, like it knew how to move through that space without being loud. We moved on that evening because it was the sensible thing to do. The lakes where we planned to camp were a short quarter-mile walk from the meadow, and we had to get down before dark. We hiked the rest of the descent with an odd, hollowed-out quiet. The fact that none of us took a picture is a sore point when you ask someone to explain. You can say we were shocked, that our hands shook, and those are true. You can say we planned to come back first thing in the morning with cameras, and that would have been a normal idea. But the truth is also blunt. When something makes your gut feel smaller, you don't make logical plans. You move and you say little, and you carry that sight behind your ribs. We set up camp by the lower tarn before the light dropped completely. We made dinner on the canister stove, the usual stuff, packaged food, coffee, nothing special. Even doing the routine things felt hollow, like we were acting inside of someone else's normal life. Every snap in the trees made us hold our breath. A twig that fell a dozen yards off sounded like a footstep. My brother kept glancing at the dark line of the timber where the big thing had vanished, and I knew he was doing the same math I'd done on the ridge. How long had it been gone? Which way had it gone? Did it see us? My boss, a man who spends a lot of time in the woods for work, kept his outward composure, but you could see the tension in the set of his jaw. That quiet kept us from sleeping well. We took turns keeping watch because it felt like the right thing to do. Not brave, but sensible. I woke up once in the middle of the night because of a noise that sounded like someone walking through dead leaves a few hundred feet away, and my pulse climbed like I'd been woken by thunder. I rubbed my hands and the inside of my cheeks because sometimes that's the only thing you can do when your body refuses to cooperate with your brain. The morning came without anything more dramatic. The tarn looked exactly like it had before the sighting, silver and indifferent. We drank coffee, packed our gear, and moved on with the trailhead in mind because that's how hikers are. Practical, stubborn, and forced into normality by the practicality of life. I told people later, but telling isn't the same as explaining. You start to become aware of how thin your language is when you try to fit something outside the catalogue of the normal into words people will accept. We saw something tall sounds small when you mean something that rearranged how you would later look at tree lines. I can still picture the way it looked in the binoculars, that dark sweep across the meadow, the long arms, the quick, smooth crossings, the way it disappeared into the trees as if the timber had accepted it and closed behind it. What I can't show is the feeling that came with seeing it, the exact pinch in my chest, the sound of my breath that turned treacherous and shallow, the way small sounds later made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I keep playing the moment in my head, trying to find a point where I might have done something different. Maybe if I'd had a better camera, maybe if we'd been less tired, maybe if we'd been alone. Those are the little rationalizations you make to hold on to a world that makes sense. There's also a smaller, weirder part of me that keeps returning to the way it moved. Not clumsy, not awkward. The step was efficient, and the arms swung like there was no need to conserve energy. That suggests something used to going upright and used to long distances, but I don't have measurements or prints or a photo that proves anything like that. I have a memory that's as stubborn as a bruise, that in less than 15 seconds a form moved across a meadow half a mile away, looked like two people from a distance and not people up close, and then vanished into the trees. The whole thing behaved like someone taking a regular, practiced path across its land. If you're someone who wants a tidy ending, I don't have one. We didn't chase it. We didn't see it again. We carried on with our day and with hiking because there are a lot of things you have to live with. There was no final reveal, no opportunity to put a measuring tape on a footprint. It simply happened and then stopped. The last clear image in my head is the dark sweep across the meadow, the way sunlight glinted on the grass for a second, and then nothing, like a film where someone hit stop mid-scene. That's the one that makes me wake in the night, sometimes feeling like I left a sentence unfinished. I write this because I keep turning that single moment over, not to ask for belief, but because the detail eats at me, the tilt of its shoulders, the lope of its stride, the certainty with which it moved through an open space and into cover. If there's any lesson from it, it's the small one I keep to myself. The woods hold more than we can name without stretching language beyond recognition. We were ordinary people on a ridge, and for fewer than 15 seconds, something else walked between us and the trees, and then walked away. It stopped, and it left me with a question that I still can't answer. Story 13. The scream came out of nowhere and changed everything. It wasn't a dog or a coyote or some drunk yelling down a gravel road. It was a raw, high animal sound that seemed to fold the whole yard inward. I remember the way it hit the open windows and pushed the air like a hand, the way it filled the night and left no room for ordinary noise. That single sound is the thing I keep going back to, the thing that makes me check doors and windows, even now. We lived in the Pinery, between Parker and Franktown, a place where houses sit on big lots, and the pines and scrub give you a feeling of distance, even with neighbors nearby. That summer had been a weird one. A few times we'd found dogs near the edges of the property in seriously bad shape. Not what you expect around here. People walk their dogs on the shoulder, and they know where foxes and raccoons live, but these were different. One morning, my father and I walked up to a shallow hollow near a big cottonwood, and there were two dogs, neighborhood dogs, curled near the base with their fur matted and hanging in chunks. Their collars were still on, but their breathing was shallow, and I could see raw patches where fur had been torn clean. Nobody could explain why they ended up like that. No blood trail, not a predator ambush that made sense. The vets shook their heads and said they'd seen predation, but not like that. Whatever had been out there didn't seem to be after food. It looked like it took something else out of those dogs. That morning changed the tone of the whole summer. People in the neighborhood started calling it in whispers at the feed store and at the stoplight when you had time to trade a worried look. My father started locking the livestock gates earlier, and I began checking my truck tires and mirrors, even if I was only going down to the mailbox. You notice small things after something off happens. A brush of movement at the tree line, a place where branches are bent lower than they should be. The day we found those dogs, the skin under my neck tightened in a way I had never felt before. It felt like an animal that didn't belong to the usual list of animals had a different rule about how it shared ground with you. That evening, we kept the windows open. It was too hot to keep the house sealed, the kind of heat that makes the porch smell like pine sap, and the inside of the house smell like old coffee and dryer lint. I sat on the back step half dozing, a beer sweating in my hand, watching the end of sunlight slide behind a ridge of trees on the property. My father was in the garage, shutting up tools, and my boss, he lives a few houses down and comes by sometimes to borrow a ladder, had stopped in to drop off some papers. We kept the back doors cracked because that's what you do in the heat, and because in that little long subdivision there's a rhythm. Kids will run through yards chasing each other, someone will walk a dog, and eventually the evening cools enough to sit on a step and make sense of the day. When the scream hit, it shredded that rhythm. It came from the pasture edge beyond the pines, a sound as if something big had been hurt in a way that didn't make sense. It exploded and echoed off the row of trees, and then ricocheted back, and for a half second, it felt like the night had been rearranged. My father jumped up and dropped the wrench he was holding. He's the kind of man who's not easily shaken, but I watched him move like someone had lit a fuse under him. He ran for the doors and slammed them shut, bolting and pushing the screens in. The sound of wood hitting wood is a small, ugly thing that sticks in my head the way a stone sticks under your foot. We all walked to the front room window after that, pressed our faces to the glass, and tried to find a reason in the dark. The dogs of the neighborhood answered. A few yelps, some frantic barking, then silence. The scream didn't echo again. It left the air with a kind of pressure, like the room had been squeezed and then let go. I could feel myself shaking and tried to steady my breath because real fear is as much physical as it is mental. My father moved slow and methodical. He checked the back gate, the barn, the dog kennels, and came back with his shirt sleeves rolled up and dirt under his nails, like he'd been outside trying to see. He told us later. He always tells things later with a flatness in his voice, as if the words are heavy, that when he ran out, he saw nothing but a place where the grass was leaned flat, like someone had walked there and then disappeared. No tracks he could swear by, no carcass, no broken fence, just a quieted path through the tall grass that ended at the stand of scrub pines. He kept saying, it screamed like something that hated being heard. And the way he said that made me understand he wasn't talking about how loud it was. He meant the tone of it. There was something in the way the thing called that made all the hair on your arms stand up. Later that same evening when the sun was low and the light had that thin golden strip you get in late summer, I got out to the edge of the property to look with binoculars. I couldn't sleep, and the quiet was too thick. I walked down a narrow deer track to a spot where the trees part and you get a straight view across the neighbor's hollow. There was a school bus idle on the far road picking up kids, and I could see its big square side catching the sun. The bus passes by that corner at the end of the route, and its rumble is something everybody around here knows. I had no expectation of seeing anything outside the ordinary. I just wanted to see if the place that had been disturbed earlier made any sense in daylight. That's when I saw it, upper half at first, hunched between the trunks, watching, the low sun catching long hairs on its arms and making them glitter like strands of rope. It wasn't a person leaning on a post, not human, not a deer or a coyote. My heart does that weird flip you get when your body realizes that sight and reality don't match. The shoulders were broad and sloped, and the head was low like it was trying to keep from being obvious. It watched with what I can only call an appraisal, the way a dog checks if a stranger is friendly, a look that measured and decided. I didn't move. I stood there with the binoculars shaking in my hands because shock turns your limbs into foreign objects. The school bus rolled by, and the noise made the figure shift, just enough that it slid away toward the neighbor's hollow with the rhythm of someone stepping into shadow. It didn't run. It slid like it made small, controlled adjustments to stay out of sight. I remember the exact flash of sunlight on the arm hair because that image is stupidly clear. The light caught the long strands, and for a second, the creature looked bigger than everything around it. I felt like I'd been watched by something that had been watching the land in a way I hadn't noticed before. That afternoon and that evening stitched into something heavier than a single moment. We'd already had the reduced summer dogs, the call in the night, and now a sighting like an interloper's quick look. My father locked up tighter, moved the livestock into covered pens and set the dogs inside. The thing is, real fear makes you tidy. You put things away in case someone or something decides to show up. We kept the porch lights on all night. The boss, who'd left earlier, came back when he heard what happened and told me later that when he flipped on his porch light, he saw a huge shape move across his yard and into the woods. He said he thought at first someone was messing around with a costume, but the shape moved like a person with the wrong proportions. Legs too long, shoulders too wide. And then it was gone. It's easy for outsiders to say people are seeing the same thing because the mind plays tricks when you're keyed up. I've heard the explanations. Dogs in heat fights, coyotes with mange, pranks, the heat making people jumpy. Maybe some nights it is that. But that summer there was something else in the trees and the pasture, and it didn't care much for dogs or for being under the lights. It had a way of staying at the edges. What bothers me most is the voice in the yard. Not a shout, not a howl, but that scream that sliced through an open window and made the whole house hold its breath. It left a shape in me that didn't let me relax. That sound sits under the good sounds of the house, under the dishwasher hum, under the radio, and every time I hear a high, thin sound, I have to remind my heart that it's just wind through the eaves. My father used to sleep easy and wait to fix the fence. After that night, he started leaving a light on in the barn, even in the morning, just in case. The little changes add up. He won't admit to being scared, but I see it in how he checks the trap line and in the way he walks the perimeter at dusk. There were small signs we tried to patch together. Scratches in the bark of the cottonwood near where the dogs were found. None deep like a bear's, but long and shallow, like something had dragged an arm across the trunk. A scattering of fur stuck to a low branch, brown and coarse. My neighbor reported finding a pile of flattened grass in a circle the size of a man's shoulders, near the wedge of trees behind his pasture. And when the kids left their bicycles out the next morning, the seats were all inclined oddly, as if something moved between them. None of it added to a file any sheriff would want to take home as evidence. It's small, hearsay stuff, things you can point to and say maybe. But to me, it's stacked together into a sense. Something in that stretch of Douglas County had a dislike for dogs and a taste for being invisible when people came near. The worst nights afterward were the quiet ones. When the house sits and the windows rattle in the wind, you start replaying sounds. My brain tries to give reasons, and then lists of reasons fall apart. The scream we heard still shows up in my head as if it's always 3 seconds away. Sometimes I wake and I think I hear it, but it's just a water heater or a distant car. Mostly, it's the memory that's louder than anything else. The exact pitch and the way the sound tapered off. It's the kind of thing that changes the house for you. You begin to think of each opening and closing as a possible event. People around here joke that our area has stories, things that feed off the land in old ways. I don't like labels. I keep telling the story to whoever will listen the way someone passes along a warning about a bad stretch of road. Don't leave dogs unattended at dusk, they'll say. And I nod because none of us want the same surprise. My father and I fixed the kennel doors with more bolts and put cameras up near the pasture line. The footage shows nothing much. Shadows, a fox once, the usual deer. Cameras only see what they see. They didn't capture the low-shouldered silhouette I saw that late afternoon, or the way the long hair flashed in the sun. They didn't catch the scream that hit the house like a thrown rock. Months blurred into being careful instead of careless. Years added little moments. The boss telling me later about what he'd seen under his porch light. The neighbor who swore he'd glimpsed something from his truck window as he pulled kids out to soccer practice. They're separate moments, but they all hang off that one summer night for me. We tried to laugh about it at barbecues and then stopped because laughter felt like betrayal of the taut little alertness that had settled over the place. The final thing that sits with me is how abruptly the whole thing cut off that night. 1 second the scream was there, entire and splitting, and the next the house was normal in the way only a house can pretend. Refrigerator hum, the tick of a clock, the neighbor's radio in the distance. It's the lack of a finale that bothers me more than anything. There was no fight, no confrontation, no clear sign that we had survived anything, just the slam of bolts and a silence that pretended nothing odd had happened. The scream didn't taper. It stopped like someone cut a cord, and that cut sits in my chest the way a splinter sits in a thumb. You know it's there, you keep picking at it, and you still can't pull it out. I can't explain why that voice happened, why the dogs were found near that tree, why a hunched shape watched through the trees as the bus rolled by, why my boss saw something huge slip into the woods when he turned on his porch light. I don't have a tidy answer. All I have are the small facts that add up in my head, the ripped fur, the bent grass, the flash of long hair at low sun, the slam of doors. That night changed how we lived on the property and changed the weight of every quiet hour that followed. It stopped then and hasn't given me an ending since. It simply broke the night into a before and an after, and I am left with the memory of the scream and the shape of the thing as it slid away into the neighbor's hollow, and no explanation to fit it into the world. Story 14. I still think about that morning up in Weld County because nothing about it fit into the list of normal things you learn to expect when you spend time in the mountains. It was opening day for Elk Camp. The heavy snow that had come down the night before turned everything into a clean map. We'd been up there putting the tents and getting the fire going, the usual routine, and the cook had a pot of something warming over the coals. I rode out alone that morning because I wanted to check a drain and see how deep the new drift was. The sky was low and white, the kind of light that makes edges look harder and keeps your eyes working. My horse is steady. I've ridden that horse through worse weather and worse country. He's calm with traffic and keeps a straight line on a slope that would make a green rider panic. Still, the cold gets into you. Your breath coming out in white puffs, your gloves fuzzing at the fingertips, the leather of the saddle stiff and squeaking. I rode out slow to the creek that sits about 90 meters from the tents, the one that runs down from the dark pine stand. The snow on the banks was soft, and the creek was only half iced, a black ribbon moving underground and making a faint noise you expect to hear. I found prints before I saw anything else. At first, it was the way the snow looked, a different kind of indent, not like a boot track or a deer hoof. These had clean, rounded edges at the toe area and a wide heel impression. I dismounted, because you don't ride over fresh tracks, you study them. The print was long. I pulled my glove off, the fingers clumsy, and put my hand near it to get an idea. My palm fit and then some. The mark was larger than my boot. I went back to the saddle and grabbed the tape from the saddlebag and measured out of habit. They came out at about 33 centimeters long, with a broad heel and what looked like 4 distinct toe impressions ahead of it. I've tracked a lot of animals in my life. Deer, elk, coyotes, the occasional bear, and each leaves a pattern. These prints did not belong to anything I recognized. Deer have a split cloven hoof. Elk have their own cloven pattern but larger. Bears leave long, rounded paw prints with claw marks that often show through when the snow's soft. These had a flat heel, then 4 rounded impressions where toes would be. No fifth toe, no drag lines, just 4 distinct toe impressions spread like someone had splayed them on purpose. They crossed the small creek cleanly. The snow on the far bank showed the negative, as if someone had stepped from one patch of bank to the next without hesitation. The stride was long, longer than mine, and the weight impression sat heavy in the heel, like a person who puts weight back on the rear foot when they step. I wasn't going to jump to any conclusions, so I walked back to camp and got the cook. He's been to Elk Country longer than me, knows the men who guide and knows what a fresh track looks like. I didn't want to say, "Hey, come look at this weird track," in a way that made us sound like tourists. So I saddled the horse and rode back to the spot with him. He didn't laugh, he didn't shrug. He just looked the way a man looks when something doesn't match what he knows. We stood there together, boots crunching snow, breath fogging. He ran his gloved hand along the edge of a print, muttered something about the placement, and then pulled out a little notebook from his pocket like someone who keeps a list. I didn't expect that. I didn't care. We measured the length and the distance between prints, the angle of the toes relative to the creek. Everything precise, everything examined. Crossing the creek made the first odd detail obvious. The prints didn't cut through the ice or skid at the edge. They crossed from bank to bank with the sort of clean lift that says the foot went down and came up in a single motion. There was no struggling, no slip tracks, not even a smear under the waterline. It was deliberate and confident. On the far bank, the line of prints seemed to stop as if someone or something had paused and chosen a path. The snow there looked pressed down in front of a dark stand of pines, like the animal had stood and looked in 3 directions before walking off. That's when the cook said, in a low voice, "We should follow it." We went on foot first. I didn't want to risk scaring the horse and making it bolt. The snow was ankle deep in places, and my breath got loud in my ears. We went slow and took turns looking for sign. Where the last and next prints should be, there was a shallow scrape and a drag of needles, and then the line led into thin trees and over a bank of fallen logs. That's when my horse, the steady one, went to his knees behind us, pawed at the snow, and started to sniff the air like something had passed him by and left a smell on the wind. When the cook called out a soft hand cluck to me, I looked back and saw it. The horse had taken a step and then refused to move forward. His ears went flat, the lower lip trembled, and he gave out a small sound I have only heard when a horse truly objects to a direction. Horses are prey animals. They sense things we don't. You hear it put casually, but in the snow near the logs, my horse's ears pinned and his nostrils flared, and he stamped once and snorted. The cook tried to budge him with a little encouragement, but the animal backed up and circled like someone trying to avoid a patch of ice. He refused to go through the fallen logs, and when the wind shifted, the smell on it seemed sharper, metallic. My chest tightened quick and stupid. The horse's panic infected me the way panic does. You think you're calm, and then the muscles in your legs go strange and small. We skirted a slope where the snow had stacked against an open face that could have collapsed if we pushed it, an avalanche slope by the look of it. The taste of that kind of slope is in your mouth. It's the taste of a mistake you can't undo. I kept my body turned away from it because you don't test an old slide lightly. We used the aspen grove instead, thinking a stand of thin trees would be safer. But the horse's reluctance got worse among the trunks. He kept belling quietly, head low, then rearing up a hair when a branch fell under a weight of snow. I tried to move him forward, then stopped because the sound behind me, something like a footstep on compacted snow, made my spine cold. We didn't have to say it out loud. The tracks led into the pines, and the last clear impressions were there at the edge, and something had stopped and looked out as if deciding which way to go. I moved closer, careful, measuring each step so I wouldn't leave any extra sign, and the snow scored under my boots shallowly. The photograph in my head is of the cook's shoulders tensed, a man who has taught hunters how to fillet elk and who knows how to hold a rifle steady. He stayed close enough to touch if I needed a hand, but not so close he'd spook the horse. The details of the tracks are burned in my head, the wide heel, the spacing of the toes, the depth where the heel settled into the soft snow like someone who puts their weight back when they step. There were 4 toe impressions, not 5. They were spaced like fingers, separated slightly, not clenched. No claw marks to speak of either. The heel was broad and had a crescent scuff on the outside. The stride between each step was long, and the print shape suggested a long foot, maybe adapted to soft ground. These were not elk or deer, not bear. They didn't fit anything in the mental shelf I keep of what walks the mountain. I have tracked people in snow before. You can read the difference between a human step and anything else because a human is intentional in a different way. The heel strikes first in boots, sometimes with a dragging toe if the ground's uneven. This was not that. If anything, it looked like a barefoot person who'd evolved to walk soft ground, broad foot, wide heel, toes splayed to distribute weight. But a barefoot person doesn't have a 4-toe arrangement like this. My mouth went dry. I felt small and stupid. My hands started to shake. I tried to get around the pile of fallen logs to get to the darker pines. The horse wouldn't go. The cook tried also, and his face went flat, like someone who is used to being practical, but who also knows when to stop. The closer we got to the stand of pines, the thicker the trees, and the darker the light under them. You felt the change physically. The air was colder and heavier under the pines, the smell of sap and old rot stronger, and the sound of the creek seemed to narrow to a single thread. My horse kept sniffing at the tread marks and kept moving his head away, as if the air itself tasted wrong. At that moment, I felt an absurd animal fear that doesn't make rooms for rational thought. I took one step closer to that last print, like I was pulling a thread, and the hair on my arms went up hard enough to sting. I heard the creak of a branch and turned my head because I thought something had moved. Nothing showed, but the silence afterward was heavier than the noise had been. The cook put a hand on the saddle horn and said something that wasn't a command, but a thing to anchor us both. I backed away. We did a slow retreat. I looked at the prints one last time, trying to burn them into my head, because you do that when you can't explain something. You catalogue what you saw in case you ever need to prove it to yourself. We skirted the avalanche slope rather than cross it, came back through a stand of aspens where the snow was half melted in the sun, and when we reached the tents, I felt like the world had gone off its hinges in a small way. The camp looked the same. The cook wiping a pan, a cup steaming, a half-built pile of firewood. Everyone was busy in 100 small ways, ordinary as any morning. I left the horse tied and went right to the woodpile and slept a while because that's what I do when my head is a mess. The small animal fix of being warm and resting. But the tracks sat behind my eyes like a shape that made no sense. There was no sudden finale, no chase, no sound of something crashing into the pines. The prints ended like someone had closed a chapter in the snow. I have never seen tracks like that before or since. They were big, precise, and they stopped as if the thing making them had paused and chosen its way. My horse's reaction, the refusal to step among the logs, the snort, the shift of panic, took that odd print and made it close and urgent. The sense of proximity chilled my bones in a way the cold alone never did. It is a small, sharp memory now. Snowy banks, a creek black under ice, 4-toed prints 33 centimeters long, a horse that wouldn't go forward, a dark pine stand that seemed to accept whatever had passed through. I can't tell you what it was because I don't know. I can catalogue the prints and the reactions and the oddities, and I can say I followed them that day, felt something close enough to set a horse on edge, and then stopped when the weight of not knowing became heavier than the need to keep going. The picture in my head stops there too, not with a spectacular end, but with a last clean step into the dark and the decision to back away and live with the question. That halt is the part that stays with me. How it just stopped, like somebody turning off a light, and how even now I can't explain why it ended that way. Story 15. I still go back to that day in my head, and it never gets any calmer. It was the opening day of Elk Camp. Heavy snow had come through the night before and blanketed everything like someone had pressed the reset button on the hills. We were set up northwest of Strawberry Park, out toward Weld County near Steamboat Springs, the kind of place where you go to get away from people and be surrounded by trees. I rode out early just to check tracks and see if anything had moved through the area overnight. I expected deer paths, maybe a few elk scrapes, the usual things. I did not expect what I found. My horse is steady. He's the kind of horse you trust on steep slopes and in the dark, the kind a lot of folks at camp use when they want to ride further than they want to wander on foot. I saddled him slow, tightened the cinch, checked the bridle and the stirrups the way I always do. The cold bites at your fingers in that weather, and you notice little things like the leather getting stiff and the breath in front of your face fogging with every word. I tucked my hands under my jacket, swung up, and rode out alone at a gentle walk, the camp tents behind me and the pine line ahead. The snow made the world sound smaller. Even the creek that runs down from the ridgeline had a muted quality. The water still moved under the ice, and you could hear it like a thread. I wasn't paying attention to anything but the sound at first. The hollow clop of my horse, the hiss of snow under his hooves, that thin taste of cold air. Then I saw them, tracks in the clean snow, not far from where the little feeder creek opens into a wider channel. I dismounted because you don't ride through fresh prints. I wanted to see how big they were, and whether they matched any of the animal prints I know. They were wrong in ways that made my whole body tighten. I've tracked elk and deer all my life. I know the shapes of hooves, the long oval of a bear's paw, even the odd drag marks left by a coyote. These prints were different. They were long and broad, with a wide heel and a front area that showed 4 distinct toe impressions. I pulled off my glove and laid my hand next to the print to get scale, and my palm looked small in comparison. I rode back to camp and fetched the tape from the saddlebag, the same tape we used to measure antler spreads and pack widths, and when I measured the length it came out around 33 centimeters. Not inches, not a boot mark. 33 centimeters long, a wide rear heel, and 4 clear toe marks ahead of it. They crossed the shallow channel cleanly, right across the little creek, a good 90 meters from the tents. I came back to camp and found the cook by the woodpile. He's the one who runs the stove for the guys at Elk Camp. He's a practical man and not the type to jump in his skin over a deer. I told him about the tracks, tried not to sound like I was trying to get him to take me seriously, and he grabbed a thermos and came out without much fuss. That's when we decided to go look together. If there's one thing you learn in the mountains, it's that 2 eyes are better than 1 when half your brain wants to tell you you're imagining things. We rode out together, boots crunching, breath steaming. He knelt at the print like he knew what to look for, running gloved fingers along the snow's edge and nodding as if cataloging things the way a cook catalogs pans. He compared the print to the length of his hand, then to a boot, and then we measured it again. He muttered, "That's not elk, not a bear." He didn't say Bigfoot or anything like that, he just looked at me, and there was this line around his mouth like someone trying to keep their voice even. We both felt that small, private weight in the chest, that sense that a thing is not like the things you know. We decided to follow it, not because we were being bold, but because we were being curious, and because the tracks were right there and we both wanted to know where they led. The line of prints crossed a little creek and came up on the other side into a stretch of young aspens, and then toward a darker stand of pines. From the far bank, the trail looked like it stopped, like somebody had paused to choose a route. That pause is what made my skin go cold more than anything else. The idea that whoever had made the prints had stopped and considered where to go. I rode to the edge of the far bank, tied the horse, and walked in slowly. Breaking a path through the snow with careful, measured steps, my horse was right next to us, grazing on a little exposed tuft of grass as if nothing was wrong. That changed fast. He raised his head when the cook walked a few paces up, snorted and moved forward to sniff the tracks. Horses are prey animals. They sense things we don't always notice. He'd been steady the whole trip, but his nostrils flared as if he caught something bitter on the breeze. He put his ears back a touch and stamped his front hoof once, as if to test the ground. I thought nothing of it at first. Then he stepped forward and recoiled, then stepped again and started pawing in a way that was not curiosity, more like objection. His sides tightened and he let out a low whuffle. You can feel panic spread. It's almost ridiculous how quickly an animal's stress becomes yours. The cook tried to soothe him, clucking and running a gloved hand down his neck, but the horse wouldn't stand still. He sniffed the air, whickered low, and then tried to edge away from the line of prints toward a patch of fallen logs. He refused to move into the area under the downed trees. The logs had a crust of snow on them, but the horse would not step among them. He kept pulling back as if an unseen force was holding him away. That moment, my horse refusing to go where the tracks led, made something in my chest drop to ice. We skirted the edge of a slope where the snow piled heavy. It was an avalanche slope by the look of it, wind-packed and with the feel of danger underfoot. My first thought was that I didn't want a spooked horse on a slope like that. The cook and I tried moving the horse along a safer path around the logs, the idea being to get through the stand of aspens and approach the dark pines from a different angle. The aspens looked harmless, thin trunks, pale bark, space enough to pass. But as I picked my way between them, my own shoulders tightened and the hair on my arms prickled in a way that has nothing to do with cold. The trail that had looked like it stopped on the far bank cut into the shady tree line. Every so often, we'd find a shallow depression in the snow, another print, then another. They were spaced out in a long stride, like they belonged to something tall and long-legged. Sometimes the four-toe impressions were clear. Sometimes the snow had drifted and softened the edges. We kept trying to skirt the pine stand, checking each print, and then the horse would put his nose down and snort and back off. He wouldn't go through the fallen logs. He stamped and gave another small whinny and tried to step back toward the open slope. That panic infected me the way the cook's silence did, like a cold that runs through you. Practical thought tells you to follow the prints, to see where it goes, to document them and come back with a saw or more men. Practical thought also tells you to keep your horse calm and yourself safe. I tried to push past the logs on foot at one point, thinking I could go a few steps into the pines, feel the air, maybe see something. The snow felt shallow under my boots where the wind had scraped it, but deeper nearer the trunks. I moved a few paces and my heart pounded so hard I could feel it behind my teeth. There was a pressure in the trees. I don't know how to say it other than that everything in the stand seemed to hold still against me. The cook had gone a little ways ahead and then turned, the line of his shoulders saying the thing I'd been hoping he wouldn't. Let's not. We skirted the avalanche slope instead, keeping to the safer side because that's what experience tells you. The slope had the look of old slides. Snow had pushed down in a sheet in the past, and now the bank gave you that uneasy sense of a weight that could let go. I didn't want to risk a panicked horse there, and the horse seemed to understand danger better than we did in that moment. We tried going back through a stand of aspens to return to camp a different way, but even the aspens felt wrong. The shadows were deeper, branches lay in unnatural angles, and the underbrush seemed flattened in patches where nothing obvious had passed. I felt foolish and small as I realized I was listening for a sound that never came. In the end, we gave up the direct follow. We rode back to camp with the tracks behind us in the snow, and the image of the horse's panic burned into me. Everyone heard the story. The cook told it the way he always tells things, straight, with a little sideways humor to mask the edge. and a couple guys went out later to see if they could find more prints. They came back with photos of vague depressions where wind had swept away detail, and one blurry shot of an imprint in a bank that didn't look like much when you tried to examine it on a phone screen. The thing that mattered to me was not the lack of proof, but that animal reaction and that pause in the trail like someone had stopped to pick a direction. The cold didn't help. Snow absorbs noise and flattens a place so every small sound jumps out. Your chest tightens and your brain wants answers. My mind kept returning to the first impression. Wide heel, 4 toes, 33 centimeters long, crossing the creek cleanly, stopping at the edge of dark pines as if choosing a path. There was no sign of a pack or clothes or anything human-made caught in the branches. No hair on the logs as far as we could see, nothing stuck to a snag or torn off, just prints and a horse who would not step among the fallen logs. The whole thing sits with me now as a small physical chill, like a draft in a closed room. I ride differently after that day, not paranoid exactly, but careful in a way that I wasn't before. When the wind is heavy and pines creak, I find myself thinking of fresh tracks and a horse refusing a route. People asked why we didn't follow it farther that day, why we didn't get more men. The answer is obvious and stupid: fear and the lack of a plan. It's easy to be brave on paper. It's harder when your horse pins his ears and your hands go numb for no reason you can name. There was no dramatic finale. Nothing charged from the pines, nothing called from the dark. It simply was there. The prints, the pause, the horse's refusal, and then the decision to back away. That decision is what haunts me. Not snagging the story with a camera or a tape, not cutting that line of tracks into a trail that we could follow later. It stopped in a way that made me stop too. We came back to camp, and the tents looked the same. Fires burned the same, but there was a different weight to the place. The rest of the day I kept checking the line of trees, hoping to see a movement that would make sense. Nothing did. I can still describe the prints to anyone who asks. The length, the wide heel, the 4 distinct toe marks spread across the front, the way they crossed that little creek in one clean motion, and how they ended at the edge of the pine stand, where someone, or something, had apparently paused and chosen a path. I can tell you about my horse and the way fear spread through him to me, and how I skirted an avalanche slope because of it. But I can't explain why it stopped that day, or what it was choosing, or whether we were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The sense of proximity that morning chilled me in a way that ordinary cold did not just the skin, but the parts under the ribs. We left the camp with a couple of men joking about seeing ghosts, folding tarps and packing up lightly because we had to move out before the melt or before other hunters came in. The tracks were still there the next morning, softened at the edges by wind, but the clear, sharp prints we found had lost the crispness that made them so wrong. I have never seen prints like that before or since. That lack of follow-up proof is its own thing. A small, nagging ache that asks you to keep the memory tidy and give it a label. In the end, the thing that sits with me is simple and stubborn. One morning, out by the tent line northwest of Strawberry Park, up toward Weld County, I found a set of tracks 33 centimeters long with a wide heel and 4 toes. They crossed a creek 90 meters from the tents and then paused at the edge of a dark pine stand, as if whoever made them was choosing a route. When I tried to follow with the cook, my horse grew nervous, sniffed the trails, and refused to move into a place among fallen logs. The panic in the horse spread to me. We skirted an avalanche slope, tried to return through aspens, and then gave up. I have no proof beyond those prints, and a memory that still makes my skin go cold. It stopped there, the trail, the chance to find out more, and I have been unable to explain why or how ever since.